I don't think I would have left the church if I hadn't worked for the church. What I went through and what I saw accelerated my path out of the church so quickly. Suddenly, I'm reading all these disciplinary council documents about really bad stuff. Horrific spousal abuse, child abuse, murder. A church leader would call us and say, I feel like disfellowshipment is too harsh for this child abuser. So I would be seeing situations where, for example, returned missionary kid has sex once, gets excommunicated. Other guy abuses a kid for 5 years and gets disfellowshipped.
Okay, that's outrageous.
In the church, you're made to feel like shit for really small things. I just couldn't believe anymore that God cared about that stuff. Because, like, what I was finding as I was reading is I cared a lot about vulnerable kids, and I cared a lot about vulnerable people who had been hurt, and I didn't care about these other things that just... what harm is being done? There isn't any that I could find.
So that led to you starting to loosen up your observance of Orthodox Mormon standards.
Exactly.
Yeah, while you're a church employee. How in the world would working for the Mormon Church cause you to start questioning and end up leaving the Mormon Church? That is what we're going to be discussing today. Hi, my name is John DeLynn. Welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast. Today I have with us Caitlin Whitaker. Hey, Kate.
Hi, John.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Recently, Kate appeared on Radio Free Mormon and Bill Reel's podcast. I've been following you for a few years. For those who are interested, we'll be talking about not just her, mission, but also her, how many years did you end up working for the church?
5.5.
5.5 years working for the church, including in the confidential records division.
Yep, department.
That interfaced with the Strengthening the Church Membership Committee, which is kind of the secret committee that investigates questioning and doubting Mormons, along with other things, and ends up directing stake presidents to excommunicate members. So, whether you think of me and Kate Kelly or Bill Reel or Sam Young, you would have been working, helping to gather information that then ended up being used by the Strengthening the Church Members Committee to reach out to stake presidents and sort of nudge them to take people like me out. So that's going to be part of today's episode. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but just generally... there's this idea of you don't want to ever see how the sausage gets made. Whether I worked on Capitol Hill growing up, and once I saw how lobbying worked, it kind of discouraged me from working in government. You kind of saw how the church sausage gets made from the standpoint of a couple departments, and we're going to be talking about how that maybe wasn't great for your testimony. Is that right?
Yeah. It was life-changing, to say the least.
Yeah. All right. So I'll just begin by asking everyone, please, if you value this content, please like this episode right now. Please subscribe to our channel. And if you can comment, we'd love your feedback in the comments, and share this episode wherever you can. That really, really helps. And we also just want everyone to know we couldn't do this type of content without our donors. So thank you to our monthly donors. And if you want to become a donor to support this type of content, just go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, and subscribe to become a monthly donor. All right. So let's jump in. So tell us a bit about your kind of Mormon upbringing and the stuff that kind of leads up to your mission that you think is relevant to kind of your faith trajectory.
Yeah, so I grew up in a very Mormon household. Like, I would say pretty strict even for like Utah Mormon standards. There was like a period of years where we couldn't even watch like PG-13 movies. We were very strict about, keeping the Sabbath day holy. Like, I did not go out to eat. I did not go to the grocery store. Like, very, very devout Mormons.
What city? What town?
In the Salt Lake Valley.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Salt Lake County.
Yeah, Salt Lake County.
Great. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And from the time I was like 11, we were living in Utah in that area and never left. So we were pretty devout. All of our neighbors were Mormon. There was like someone across the street who was inactive, but like everybody basically was a member of the church. And that was my whole life was church.
So strict family upbringing, like the whole swearing, caffeinated beverages,
So
our
actually,
movies, all that.
caffeinated beverages were like a weird thing for us. Like when I was really little, my mom discouraged it, and we would like proudly tell her that at like a birthday party, they had a choice between the caffeinated soda or like Hawaiian punch, and we drank the Hawaiian punch type of stuff. But yeah, no swearing, no rated R movies. Like we were the Clean Flicks family. Like I don't know if you remember Clean Flicks.
Remind us.
So Clean Flicks was like this store where you could go and rent like already edited movies. Like it's like the prehistoric version of VidAngel.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could go and rent a DVD or rent a movie, and they had already bleeped out everything.
They bleeped the swear words and cut out the sex scenes. Is that right?
Yep,
Okay.
Exactly.
Did they cut out violence or not really?
They would, I think.
Okay,
I don't
okay.
remember for sure, but yeah. Basically that was how I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was really young, I got my patriarchal blessing when I was like 13, I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like one of my more life-changing moments, I think. Just because I was told a lot of interesting things in it. Like some people have kind of boring patriarchal blessings, and which is totally okay. But like mine told me that I had like been sealed to somebody in a previous life. Not sealed. They said I had made a promise, which is basically a sealing, if you ask me. Like I had made a promise with someone in the pre-existence before coming to Earth, and he was supposed to be my husband. Like I was supposed to wait for him. I would know when he comes into my life, like the Spirit would tell me. And that's like a huge weight to have on your shoulders as a 13-year-old, I think, because I was just coming into an age where I was having crushes on boys, and like I was just kind of figuring out who I was, but there's like this weight of eternity on me. Like I felt that from a very, very young age, just this crushing weight. And are you familiar with the book Spiritual Survival in the Last Days?
No.
It's by
Sounds like Visions of Glory.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's called Spiritual Survival in the Last Days by like Blaine and Brenton Jorgensen or something like that. And in that book, they describe a vision that John Taylor had of the last days. And the last days are described in like, I mean, it is bleak. It's pretty tragic. Like he's describing like cannibalism, like moms eating their babies and like just crazy stuff in there. And like now that I read it, I'm like, okay, John Taylor had issues. But I was like preteen reading that. So it like really from a young age, I had like this weight of like, okay, the apocalypse is going to come, like the end of days is coming. I have to be so righteous. Like I have to make sure I am ready for when Jesus comes down from heaven and like splits the Mount of Olives with his foot, you know, like that's where I was at.
If I can add that, thinking that you already promised yourself to somebody in the pre-existence means that you're not just trying to find a compatible person to marry. You have to find the person. But then how do you know if it's the person? I don't think I could have dealt with that stress. I just want to tell you that wouldn't have worked for me because I didn't get answers from God. And so like, how would I know?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of the dilemma I had. Even, as a teenager, you're supposed to just be having fun. But I went into every date like, this could be it. Like, and I had that kind of encouragement from some of my family members too of like, well, is he the one? And I'm like 16, 17. And I'm like, and looking back, I'm like, no, duh, he's not the one. I'm just supposed to be having fun right now. But that just wasn't an option for me. And so it was just a tremendous amount of pressure. I did dabble in like theater and writing a little bit in high school, but I still felt like all of this pressure of like, I shouldn't be doing things I enjoy. Like we need to work on building the kingdom. Like this is the last days. And so I ended up like going to college, but I didn't really.
A couple questions before college.
Yeah.
So you're the oldest of
7 kids.
So a large family. Okay. And those high school years, we always give people a chance to talk about dating and kind of bishop interactions and kind of worthiness. Was there any unpleasant bishop or church interactions or any sort of, because we've highlighted on Mormon stories that guilt and shame can often be kind of central to the to the business model of Mormonism in terms of making people feel like they need the church or they need to feel terrible about themselves so that then the church can be the thing that we cling to, and that's good for the church. And some would argue it's maybe not good for us. But any of that in your teen years that you want to talk about?
So when I was like 12 or 13, I remember sitting in like a bishop's interview, and he had just asked me like, is there anything like you need to repent of? And I remember just sitting there because I was pretty innocent. Like I really hadn't been exposed to a whole lot in my life. And so I remember just sitting there and like racking my brain, and I was like, hey, there's no way that I'm like perfect. Like there has to be some things that I've done wrong. And I remember like confessing and being like, well, I don't always read my scriptures and I don't always say my prayers. And I remember like feeling really guilty bringing that up, but you're always like told in Mormonism like to be striving for perfection and striving for the next thing. And so like even when by anyone's standards I was 12, but I still had this feeling of like, yeah, but I'm not perfect. Like there has to be something. Like there's always something to be working on. I did have a boyfriend when I was like 17, and we did like the lightest of stuff that was not a big deal. But I remember too feeling so much shame about it and, confessing it to my bishop and feeling terrible. And like, I don't even know if he told me to stop taking the sacrament. Like it wasn't whatever it wasn't a big enough deal that I was like having to like stop taking the sacrament or go through disciplinary council. But like the shame was so real of just, I have these feelings and these desires, but they're bad, and like my body doesn't belong to me. Kind of like what we were talking about with my patriarchal blessing. Like in the pre-existence, I promised somebody that I would be theirs, and that God had control over my body, and I didn't even have ownership of that. When I did that, I was robbing my future husband of something, and I was robbing God of something, which is just a horrible way to live your life as a teenager when your hormones are raging, when you have like these natural desires. So I do remember feeling like very, very guilty. But I don't think I had like any crazy experiences with bishops being bad. Like, I know a lot of people do, but that just wasn't mine.
And then how was your testimony? I'm assuming you did release time seminary through your high school.
I graduated seminary.
And then how did you feel? Do you feel like by the time you were a senior in high school, the church is true and you're an Orthodox traditional believer? Were you a doubter? Sometimes Utah Mormons in their teen years have a reputation of like partying and like not really taking it seriously, but then cleaning things up right before the mission. How was your faith and your testimony through your high school years and by the end?
I think I went through like periods of rebellion, but not rebellion like partying or anything. It would be rebellion like, for example, I made it into BYU, and then Provo.
Okay.
And then everyone was so proud of me because like my mom's whole side of the family, they'd all gone to BYU and graduated, found spouses, gotten married. But I was the oldest grandchild on that side of the family and the oldest child. And I remember thinking like, I actually think BYU kind of sucks. Like, I don't like that they have an honor code. I don't like how controlling they are. And I think it was just a manifestation of the way I had been controlled my whole life, right? By the institution, by family, by whoever. And so I think my like act of rebellion by saying no was me kind of responding to the way that I had been treated my whole life, of just feeling like I couldn't have ownership of my life. I just felt like it was a very controlling religion, and I don't think I fully realized that at the time. It was more subconscious, but the only way I could act out was by saying no to BYU. So that's what I did. And I think at the time, though, I thought that like Satan was really working on me and that I was actually a bad person. So I was like, well, I'm doing this rebellious thing, but like the rebellious part of me can't be like, I need to figure out how to get rid of it. And like later I would come to learn that like that rebellious part of me is like the part of me that's alive, the part of me that makes me human. Are you
starting to feel some feels right now?
Yeah.
Just around ownership of self?
Yeah. And also the shame that I felt over being my own person. So like, I felt so much pressure to follow my family's footsteps, right? My mom and dad met at BYU and got married. My grandma and grandpa met at BYU and got married. I felt so much pressure to like fit this mold, but I had always wanted something different, I think. In high school, I had done like theater, and I was the poetry editor of our literary magazine. I did a lot with art, but art, I don't think is super compatible with Mormonism when you're just looking at Mormonism on its face. Like, I think there are a lot of brilliant artists in Mormonism. I've seen some beautiful paintings and artwork, but like, you kind of have to rebel to make good art and to really explore the human experience outside of like black and white thinking. You have to rebel to do that. You cannot stay rigid. And so I think I just always felt like that part of me was bad, like, because that's what you're conditioned to believe is like, this isn't conducive to building the kingdom of God. This doesn't make people feel the spirit. It makes them question things, and it makes them feel different. And I just felt like that part of me was bad. And so I really, really tried to repress it. In fact, like my whole high school experience, I told myself, I'm only gonna like fuck off during high school. Like, and by fuck off, I just mean do art. Like I meant like doing writing, doing theater. I would only do that in high school, and then I would be serious with my life, and like I would just devote it to God. And so that's what I did. I let myself do theater all through high school. And then I started going to college, and I had no examples in my life of women who had gone to college and like actually gone to get an education. Everyone that I knew and all the experiences I had ever been told about were women going to college to get married. So here I am at college, not married, not really knowing what my next step is. And that's when President Monson announced the missionary age change. So for me, a mission felt like a fresh start. Like I could repent of like my evil ways where how dare I want to do something as worldly as like performing or being in theater or whatever. And I could repent, and like I could devote my life fully to God for 18 months and kind of start over was what my thinking. And then I would be able to find a husband.
So you graduated high school what year?
2011.
2011. Okay, and then how long were you? You went to UVU? Is that
I went
right?
to UVU, yeah.
For how long?
I went
before
there
your mission?
For like a year before my mission, and then I think I had maybe tried to start another semester. I don't remember for sure.
A little bit.
I didn't get very far. I also was like flunking my classes because I didn't have a sense of purpose. My purpose was to serve the kingdom, but also my purpose, like I didn't know why I was at college if it wasn't to get married. Nobody had ever given me like a sense of purpose or a sense of self outside of Mormonism. And so it was very confusing for me to be there and to see people who seemed to know what they wanted to do with their lives and who had their lives together. But for me, like my purpose is I find a spouse and that's what I do. And it was just hard for me. And so once President Monson made that announcement, I was like, oh, that's why I felt so lost. I'm supposed to go on a mission. Yeah. Yeah.
For our Never Mormons, there's an interesting cultural dynamic where most Mormons who are Orthodox and believing love BYU and think it's the greatest thing. But you are allowed to hate BYU if you're a University of Utah fan or a Utah State Aggie. Like Utah State Aggies hate BYU. And there's a lot of University of Utah fans who hate it too. So, I mean, while I can see that because of your family tradition, you would have felt guilt and that it was rebellion to not go to BYU, there are a couple pockets where that's actually okay.
Yeah, exactly. But some parents would have been like, oh, thank goodness.
But your handle, Poetic Kate, so that explains you love poetry and you love art and you love writing and you love acting and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that handle is old. That I made that probably when I was 17 or 18.
Wow.
So it was just my little, and I liked that it sounded kind of like a verb, Poetic Kate. Like, so I was like, that's going to be my handle. And then it turned into something, it's grown as a brand, I guess, over the years.
Okay. So when you're when you're graduating high school or at UVU, you're thinking you're going to, okay, go on mission, then get married in the temple, and then have kids. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Were you thinking I'm going to be a church employee? You certainly weren't thinking I'm going to get divorced, but also you were going to be thinking I'm going to be a church employee, correct?
Yeah, that was not in my life plan at all.
Yeah.
It was nothing involved. I didn't even really know you could work for the church. It was just kind of like a thing some people did, and it seemed kind of elusive and mysterious. But I had no idea that was an option.
Okay. So you decide to heed the call, President Monson's call, right?
Yeah.
And so you apply to go on a mission in that huge wave where all the Mormon young women, where the age was reduced from 21, was it 21 to 19 for women? Mm-hmm. So you applied during that.
Yeah. If I'm remembering the timeline correctly, he made that announcement in October, and in February I was gone.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And you got called to where?
Argentina, Rosario, Argentina.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how'd that go?
It was the hardest 18 months of my life. I went stateside first, and I was waiting for my visa in Virginia. And I really think my mission, besides one other thing, my mission was really the first time I started to see the cracks in things.
In the church. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And and just.
Wait, you said one other thing. Is that something you don't want to talk about? Or you do?
I'm open to talking about it. It's a little bit of a tangent.
Was it before your mission?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's mention it. Just chronologically.
So when I was young, I want to say I was younger than 15. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I found out about the second endowment. When I was a kid, basically.
Tell our never Mormons what that is, or what you thought it was at the time.
So the second endowment is what Mormons refer to as having your calling and election made sure, which means you've been so righteous that you have been handpicked to go to the temple and do a separate ordinance, a separate ceremony.
And it usually happens for people in their 50s, 60s, or 70s when they're older, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And I think if I'm remembering right, it was one of my grandparents was talking about it. We would go to my grandparents' house and have these really deep gospel discussions, and it just came up at one point. And I remember feeling so betrayed when I heard about it. Because again, I had been working really hard my whole life to be good. And I thought if you're good, God will bless you, and God will he'll show you the way. And so I hear about this secret ordinance that nobody talks about, but it makes sure that you're going to go to heaven. It's even more of a promise than what you do in the temple normally. And I remember just thinking but why would God do that? It felt so personal. But I'm good. So why is it only some people? Why isn't it everybody? And how do I make sure that I get that someday? I said, this stuff weighed on me a lot as a kid. I'd already had my patriarchal blessing telling me this weird thing about making a promise before I came here. But then to hear on top of that, God had hidden something from me that was important. And I was but it's not in the scriptures. I remember racking my brain and being I've never read about this. How could God hide something like this from me? And but it's something that they do. And I remember trying to make a promise to myself, I'm going to make sure I do everything I can so I get that someday. Because I want to know that I'm going to make it to heaven. Mm-hmm. And that's a young age to find out about that. I know it rocks people's worlds even in their 20s, 30s, 40s, finding out about it. And so it was really but it was a shelf item, right? That's what they call them. It's an item you put on the shelf that you just don't think about because it's too hard. You can't reconcile it. Mm-hmm. And so besides that one thing, my mission was the other thing that started to show me some cracks. Really
quickly, just for those who are hearing about, you called it the second endowment. Mm-hmm. It's also referred to as the second anointing. And Mormon Stories has covered it at least a couple times, at least three or four times. The interview with Tom Phillips is sort of our groundbreaking episode that we released back around 2014, 2015, where a former high-level leader from the UK just tells his full story of being a stake president and then knowing Jeffrey R. Holland and then eventually getting a second anointing. It's a great one to listen to. We also do a couple interviews with Hans Mattsson, a former area authority from Sweden, where he talks about getting a second anointing with his wife, Birgitta. And then we have another episode with Brian Buchanan on the history of the second anointing. And then there's also one guy who talked about finding the letter of his grandparents.
Oh, wow.
That's like the invitation to get the second anointing. He found that after they died, and he was kind of rummaging through their papers. But what's troubling about it is it's several things, but that it's secret, but also that it's hidden from members, and that usually wealthy, connected Mormons get it. So it's not like if you're a school teacher that's just really faithful or super righteous, or a housewife, or a mother. It's more like if your grandpa's a general authority, or your father-in-law is a general authority, or your dad's really rich, or you're really rich.
Or your buddy with an apostle.
Yeah, then you get it, and that and then they tell them, no matter what age they get it, unless you murder somebody, you're guaranteed to be in the highest level of celestial kingdom, to become a god, and to live with your family and Heavenly Father forever. And literally, they could then turn around and look at porn and cheat on their spouses, and they're fine. It's only murder that would then keep them out of heaven. And then why? Anyway, I just want to make sure people understood the full depth of why this is such a problem. So
yeah. Thank you. And honestly, because when I had heard about it, I almost told myself maybe people misunderstand what it is, right? And so one of the things that really helped me actually was one of the podcast episodes you mentioned, where the stake president from the UK talked about it. And I was like, okay, so it is real. It is an actual thing that happens. And I was right to feel wrong about it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
so
it's a problem. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that second anointing was your first crack. It happens when you're a young teenage girl. Now your mission becomes your second. How did that happen?
So on my mission, I think was the first time I was exposed to experiences that didn't fit my worldview. So besides growing up Mormon, I grew up very conservative, like very political. And I had always been told that immigrants are bad people. Like, they broke the law, they should be deported, they're terrible, they should be out. And I think regardless of like people's political stances, it's probably, I think we can all agree it's dehumanizing to refer to literal people that way, and to say like they deserve to be ostracized and kicked out and they shouldn't be here. But I believed all the stuff. Like, I believed that they were here just to sell drugs, that they were here just to do crime and stuff like that. And looking back, like, it's horrible that I was ever taught that, but that's what I believed. And so then I'm on my mission in Virginia waiting for my visa, and I'm meeting immigrants. And nothing I had been told about immigrants was true. Nothing. They were good people. They were kind. They were here to escape some really horrible things a lot of the time. Like, they would tell you where they had come from, and you couldn't help but just ache for them, right? I mean, because they missed their countries most of the time. They're like, oh, I miss it so much, but I can't go back. But it was like a very life-changing moment for me to realize my worldview maybe wasn't actually the correct worldview.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And it kind of started me on a really interesting path.
Like, if I got that wrong, what else do I have wrong?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And oh man, I'm really grateful to my mission self, like, for all of the mistakes, right? Because I don't think it's good that I went out and like colonized in another country and contributed to harm in that way. But I am like so grateful to that little missionary who saw that and just said, I can't believe that this is right anymore. I can't believe that like what I've been taught about immigration is true. Because I think just cracking it open just a little bit led me down the rest of my life. Genuinely, I really think that letting myself be open to that compassion and that empathy, it paved the way for everything else to come.
Yeah, I've mentioned the quote from Mark Twain that travel is fatal to prejudice. You've heard that quote before?
I haven't actually, but that's a great quote.
Yeah, he said it 100 whatever years ago. Mm-hmm. But isn't it so conflicting that we have regrets about our Mormon missions, but also deep gratitude? Because I had very similar experiences on my mission where it just opened up my my view of the world. And it's because I lived in Guatemala for 2 years. You know what I mean? Yeah. So
yeah. It's like so interesting. You can hold both, right? Like you can say, man, that was a harmful thing. It's not great. And also I'm so thankful to who I was and like where it led me.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Anything else about Virginia before you get shipped off to Argentina or?
Not really. Okay. I mean, the mission culture is so different between those two areas of the world. So I think that was really interesting for me too. But we can move on to Argentina. It was hard. It was a very, very hard transition for me. The transition from MTC to the mission field was easy. I had so much fun. And then going to Argentina was just culture shock. Very, very different lifestyle and culture down there. And it was very, very difficult. Even when I came back from my mission, I remember telling people, like, even if God came down and told me to my face, like, I need you to go back, I was like, I wouldn't. And I would tell him that.
What were the hardest parts about your mission in Argentina?
I think the hardest part, genuinely, is you're told that you are going to change lives, that the country is going to completely transform because you're there. You're reading in the Book of Mormon about Alma and the sons of Mosiah and all the success they're having and how they did it.
Amongst the, quote, Lamanites, right?
Yes. Yeah. And you're thinking, well, cool, like if they did it, I can do it, and I'll see the fruits of my labor. And the reality of it for me is it's like hitting your head against a brick wall over and over again and thinking it's your fault that for some reason that brick wall isn't moving. Mm-hmm. And that really, like, it was hard for me. It was very hard. And I remember feeling so conflicted because on one hand, why isn't this working? Why isn't going out and tracting every day and making contacts and knocking doors and praying and reading my scriptures? Why isn't this working? And then on the other hand, or like another aspect of it was, like the church is true though. It has to be true because like there was no other option. It had to be true. And so eventually I came to the conclusion that I was just a bad missionary. Like it was my fault. Like the messenger was the problem. It wasn't the message. And like, that's kind of what I've said a couple of times is like, instead of thinking the message is garbage, I thought I was garbage. And that does a huge number on you, like in the mental gymnastics and just the self-hatred you almost have to say, well, it's my fault. It's not that Jesus and Joseph Smith can't do anything for these people. It's that I am not an effective messenger.
Yeah, and that's heavy because if the stakes are so high, if it's these people's eternal salvation that's at stake, and then they're not joining, and you conclude that it's because of your inadequacy, then you're holding people from their eternal salvation. And if you really believe those are the stakes, what's that like?
I mean, it's so hard just because I remember I didn't have very many baptisms while I was there, and I wanted baptisms, but I also didn't because some of the people we were teaching, I could tell weren't ready. I was like, okay, we could baptize them, but I don't think they know what they're getting into. Like, I don't think they've really felt it. They haven't felt it the way I feel it, and I feel it feels wrong to push them into baptism because then they're just going to be another number, right? They're just going to be another name on the list of 500 names on the word directory, and then there's only 4 people going to church.
Yeah.
So it was a tremendous amount of pressure, and like I just remember feeling like a total failure, but I couldn't even articulate why because I was doing all of it. You know, like I was getting up on time. I was going and knocking doors and getting out there. And so when it wasn't resonating with people, it just did such a number on me. It was so weird that like the harder I worked, the more distant I felt from God. Like I really felt a lot of darkness while I was there. And it didn't make any sense to me because I was like, I'm doing all of it. Like I wasn't, and even for missionaries that do kind of jack off and don't do anything, like that I feel like that's totally a valid experience, but like I genuinely was doing all of it and I wasn't feeling anything. And that, when that's your whole life for 19 years is the church, and then you're out there doing the thing that you're told is going to bring you the most happiness and you're not feeling anything. I mean, I think I was just mentally torturing myself trying to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. And I also came to the conclusion while I was there, like we would be trying to give people a Book of Mormon in like a dirt room with no water, like very little food. And I remember it felt so wrong to me. I was like, I don't think this is what they need, but I've been told this is what they need. So now I'm like in this weird conflict of like trying to figure out, okay, well, they have to need it then. Like the apostles and the prophet and all these people have said that they need it. So maybe I'm missing something, but like right in front of my face, it was clear they didn't actually need it. So it was just kind of a mind fuck is what they would call it.
Now, really quickly, I'm confused about one thing. So, Latin America is famous for like high baptism rates within the Mormon church. Like on my mission in Guatemala, the mission would have 700 baptisms a month. Many companionships would have between 10 and 40 baptisms a month. I know that Chile had even better numbers than Guatemala when I was serving. Is Argentina different, or just were missions different between when I went and when you went? Why were the numbers lower in Argentina? Do you have any idea?
That's a really good question. I think there's probably a lot of things happening. I think the missions are different, right? So like decades had passed, and like so we would go into a branch, and the list would say there's 500 members. But there's only 4 people going to sacrament meeting.
4 out of 500?
Yeah, or
that's
maybe
crazy.
Like 7.
Yeah, that's crazy. Less than 10 out of 500. Mm-hmm. So they had been doing those crazy baptism techniques for decades, and it wasn't good for the church, clearly.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think that really affected me too, because I was like, well, if all these people got baptized and all these missionaries wrote home saying, oh, I got a baptism, who cares if in like 5 or 10 years they're not going to church, or even in a year they're not going to church? Yeah. So like, where's the disconnect? Like, what's happening to not keep them there? And I think even our mission motto was fruto que permanece, which just means like fruit that like stays or remains constant, right? And so that was one of our goals, was kind of to reactivate people, to go around and try to get them to feel what they had felt when the missionaries were teaching them the first time. But I remember talking to some people and getting really emotional, because I would ask them about their baptism and they wouldn't really have anything to say about it. Like they didn't really have a memory of it, or it didn't mean anything to them. And I remember crying to my mission president and saying like, they don't understand their baptismal covenant. Like, and that was so, for me at the time, I was like, someone baptized them without helping them learn what that was. So yeah, that was just a really... It was very weird to go and see like almost like these dead zones of like places that used to have a lot of growth in the church, and then suddenly there was no growth at all, and in fact it had been like dying on the vine. And so I think that's also part of what made the disconnect so interesting, was you hear from like the older generations like, oh, we baptized so many people, we saw so many like miracles, and then you're there and you're like, well, the miracles all died. Like there's nobody coming to church now. Yeah.
Yeah. For those who don't know, the Mormon Church claims over 17 million members in 2025, but estimates that are in Latin America, 10% of the people that have been baptized Mormon remain active today. The activity rates are abysmal. And of those 17 million, the church claims, estimates are that about 4 million of those across the world are active. So 2/3 of the people who have ever been baptized Mormon do not identify as Mormon, do not attend the church. So, the actual statistics are what to pay attention to in terms of activity rates, not the absolute number the church claims. Because as you testified in Argentina, it's less than 10% activity rates.
Oh yeah. At least in the areas I was in. Yeah. And it was a huge problem. Yeah. And so I think that's also why baptisms felt kind of pointless to me, because I was like, well, unless I really can tell that they're going to stay in it, I don't want to just have a baptism to have a baptism. And there was a guy, So I also kind of saw through miracles, like, and what people would describe as miracles. I had this experience where we invited a guy to church and he came, which was, I mean, for us, that was nuts to invite someone to church and have them actually show up. And after the church meeting was over, he was like, "This is the true church of God. I want to be baptized." Like, I felt the Spirit. I mean, our little missionary hearts were just exploding. We were like, holy crap, like, he felt the Spirit. He is ready for this.
They call these golden converts, right?
Totally, golden investigators. Yeah. Like, we were like, holy crap, like, this guy is it. And it was so interesting because I like wrote home and I was so excited about him. And within the time I wrote home and then the week in between, because at the time we could only email our families once a week, in that week time, we actually found out that he had been going by a different name, an alias. He was a scammer and a fraudster, and he was an older guy, and his whole thing was just getting all chummy with older women to get money from them. And there are a lot of older women in our ward, and we were like young missionaries, and so he just loved spending time with us, but it was like not a legit interest in the church at all. And when we found out that he'd been lying about his name and who he was, we had to tell him, like, hey man, like, screw off. Like, we actually can't baptize you. But just that, the elation and like excitement that we felt to just being completely deflated after realizing like the truth. Yeah. And I remember thinking, okay, I actually don't think any of these missionary miracles are real. I think it's people having experiences that, like, at first seem really legit, but when you dig into them a little bit more, it's not real. And that was, I remember just being like, okay, so it's all just a bunch of dummies, like, including me, like, because at first I really thought this guy was it. And he... And like, I was really surprised too, like, that we didn't feel like the spirit of discernment or anything. We just thought he was this real guy. And then we realized he had totally different motives.
Yeah. Well, that would be really disheartening to just have to see that the fruits of the church weren't really helping the Argentinian people, to feel like you weren't having success. And then to sort of start to realize that even the spiritual experiences those around you are claiming are probably just people's own emotions and thoughts that turn out to be false. I mean, I would imagine you'd feel pretty awful by the end of your mission. Oh,
I was doing pretty bad by the end of it. And even when I look back on journals and stuff, I'm like, holy cow, how was I not in therapy to like kind of work through some of this stuff? But even coming home was a bit of a relief, just because I had my family again. I had a normal life again. Like, everything felt better temporarily. And I got engaged really quick. Well, I started working for the church.
Did you mention, maybe in the other interview I listened to with Bill and RFM, that like, by the time you get off your mission, if you had been asked to serve another year or whatever?
Yeah, if God had asked me to go back, I wouldn't have gone back.
That's so extreme.
Yeah, but I told people that too. Like, I mean, I'm talking like members of the church. Like, I don't know if I would have told my bishop that, but I told like my parents and I told other people. I was like, I would not go back. Like, and it was that bad. And I'm like, and I think God knows that. Like, if God is real, he knows that it was that bad and that nothing of worth happened out there. Like, there was no reason to go back. And like, it was so funny because I think you get a lot of positive reinforcement and validation in the church, right? So I come back, I was released honorably. I'm like giving my talk, you know, my homecoming talk in sacrament meeting, and people just think you're the best. They're like, wow, good job. You served the Lord, which like feels good in a very hollow kind of way, because inside I was like, you don't get it. Like, you don't know what I went through out there, and it's not what they tell you. But how do you even say that to someone without sounding insane?
Folks just want to congratulate you and say, "Go, the church is true." Like, yes. The field is white. You know?
Like, let's totally give space, like how they want to support you in that way. But in deep inside, I was like, I don't know who to talk to about this. I don't like. Maybe it was a fluke. I don't know. But I knew that if it was only me in the room, if it was only me in the room with like mirrors everywhere, right, and I only was facing myself, I would have told myself, and I did many times, I said, you know, your mission didn't do anything. And that, it was crushing, because 18 months of your life.
Basically 2 years, yeah.
Anything else that I had spent 18 months on, I would have seen something come of it. If I had done anything useful, like, there's no way that you wouldn't get something out of it if you're practicing dance for 18 months, if you're writing, if you're doing something. But I had done this for 18 months, and I genuinely, it just felt like a desert. I was like, I was just digging in a desert, doing nothing, and being told the whole time, being cheered on the whole time, like, good job, you're doing so good, this is great, you're building the kingdom. What kingdom? There are 7 people going to church, like, and most people hate us, like, in the streets and stuff. Like, they didn't want to talk to us. And again, there were like pieces of me that knew it wasn't my fault, but I wasn't ready to come to terms with that. So I did once again just double down on, yeah, but it's because you were a bad missionary. Like, so it's, let's say I'm in the room with myself. There's like a darker person in there, but it's still me saying, yeah, but it's your fault. You're the reason that you didn't see more success and that you don't feel like it was a success. And like you do when you're just really brainwashed, I was like, well, then I'll double down and I'll just work even harder.
You know, we often try to highlight that blame reversal is one of the techniques of a cult, where if a promise doesn't work out, you're blamed for it. But it's even more masterful if they can get you to perform blame reversal on yourself. Which just sounds like it's not like the church was telling you you're worthless. You were telling yourself that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it works so well, because if something's not working, well, just give more of your time to the church, give more of your money to the church, give more of your thoughts to God. And that's what I did. I came home, and within a month and a half, maybe, I was working for the church.
How'd you get, like you said before, you didn't even know working for the church was an option. How did you come to work for the church and so quickly off your mission? How did that happen?
So I think it was my dad who mentioned, like, hey, you could just start working for the church. Like, that's a great source of income. Like, they could probably use your Spanish. And I remember looking on the church's website, like, they have like careers.lds.org or whatever it was at the time. And I just searched in there and I found a position, and they needed somebody who spoke English and Spanish. It was part-time. And I was like, well, that sounds like something I can do. So I applied, and I want to say, I mean, it was so quick. Like, by the end of September or the beginning of October. So I got home in August from my mission, and by the end of September, maybe beginnings of October, I was working for the church.
And this is 2015 or?
2014.
2014. Okay. Wow. So spring of 2014, you're working for the Mormon church.
Yeah, it was fall of 2014.
Okay, fall of 2014.
Yeah, because August is when I got back, and then it's by September, October.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So had you been warned that working for the church can be bad for your testimony before you went to work for the church, or did you not have that in your mind?
I did not have that in my mind, I don't think at all.
Okay.
You know, I was still kind of trying to play that hunky-dory missionary that's just like, I believe it all. And like, I remember though, because of where I would be working, the lady who interviewed me, she asked me, she's like, how would you respond to seeing an apostle? She asked me that. And I was thinking in my head, like, I'm going to see apostles working here? Like, that's crazy. But I remember telling her, I was like, well, I think I would blush. And I said, and I don't think I would say anything. Like, I would just let them keep walking, because, like, what do I have to say to them, you know? But I think it's a big issue is, like, people will, like, try to stop apostles and talk to them, and they consider them to be celebrities. And so I think she was really trying to vet me, because she's like, you're going to be working in the basement of the church administration building. Like, I saw apostles going in and out on go-karts. Like, they're not go-karts, golf carts and stuff. So I think she was just really trying to make sure I wasn't going to, like, try to take a picture with one of them or something.
Yeah, that was the right answer, by the way. I mean, the apostles don't like to be stopped and asked questions.
Oh, I believe it. And I think I mean, at the time, I think my answer came from the fact that I'm like, well, who am I to stop an apostle? Like, I'm not going to talk to them. But yeah, like I wasn't even trying to give a right answer, if that makes sense. But it was, like you said, the right answer that led to her saying, well, yeah, she can work here. And I found out later, too, that like she takes names to the temple to consider who to hire. And so when they told me that, I remember being like, okay, so God does want me here. Like,
nice.
It was like this positive validation I got.
Maybe you've already mentioned this, but it was like my mission wasn't great, but I'll make it up working for the church. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what, I mean, it wasn't very conscious at the time, but I remember a few years later in therapy, my therapist was finally like, are you ready to admit to yourself that the reason you started working for the church is because you felt like you were a failure on your mission? And I remember that revelation just hit me so hard. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's totally what it was. Like, I couldn't go back to working a worldly job because I had failed my mission, like the thing that was supposed to make up for all of my shortcomings. I had nothing to show for it. And so I said, well, then I'll just work harder and I will just give myself even more to this.
Okay, so your first role was just answering phones, is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
So they would call the main church number and they'd ask to be transferred to HR or to LDS Charities or donations in kind or like meeting house facilities, like FM group type of things. Trying to think what else. Basically, anything the church covers, they would call that main number if they didn't know where to go.
Information technology.
IT, local unit support, all of that.
Membership records. Yeah.
And that was, my job was just to transfer calls. There wasn't anything super significant that happened in my time there, like nothing that would have affected my testimony. Like it was a nice place to work, just very low key.
And you were there how long in that role?
I was there from September, October of 2014 until July of 2015, I want to say.
Okay. So almost a year.
Almost a year, yeah. And what happened is I got engaged in December of 2014 and I was married in May. And
do you want to share how you knew he was the one, like the one you had met in the pre-existence? Did you? Oh
my gosh, that is something I wanted to cover. So by the time I got back from my mission, it seemed so miraculous in this patriarchal blessing, right? This miracle of you're going to know when he comes into your life, the Spirit's going to tell you. And by the time I got back from my mission, I just did not believe in miracles like that anymore. I believed in the church still, and I believed there was like hard work that could produce miracles, but I didn't believe in those kinds of miracles.
Not because you were faithless, I'm guessing, but because you just didn't see them actually being real. Is that right? You were kind of disillusioned because again, you would think the church would be a blessing in everyone's life in Argentina and you would have an amazing mission, but that didn't happen. So It's like, how many times do you have to get severely disappointed before you start being a little bit jaded?
Exactly. And I forgot to mention this, but on my mission, one of my mission leaders, I don't want to say exactly who because I have more to say about him later, but he told me at one point, he was like, we are going to kneel across the altar from each other. Oh, this is a fellow missionary. Yes. Telling you, He's like, I've had a revelation. He's like, I know I'm supposed to marry, I was blonde at the time. He's like, I know I'm supposed to marry a blonde from the U.S. He's like, that's in my patriarchal blessing. What? And he's, very, very weird. And he's like, I know that's my path. And he's like, I think you're the one. And I remember sitting there like, no way, man. And this was towards the end of my mission too. So I was already feeling pretty jaded, right? And I was just like, I don't think you know what that means. Like, I don't believe you when you say that. And I'm glad that that's how I felt, because I think some people would go, oh man, he's like my leader on the mission who's like telling me what to do. This is the answer to my patriarchal blessing. Right, you would think. Like, it was the perfect setup for me to be like, wow, I guess we both had this vision that, like, this is what's supposed to happen to us. But I just remember being like, get away from me, man. Like, I literally just was, like, so turned off by it, because I was like, how dare you say that? Like, what do you mean? Like, we don't even know each other. I'm, like, very close to leaving. He was just about to leave to go home. So I was very, very wary of that. And so by the time I get home, I'm like, well, I'm supposed to just know who this guy is. There's no way. And I had seen so many scary people too in Argentina. And like, I mean, there was a bishop in one of my areas who had been like cheating on his wife and getting away with it for forever. And
While
like,
he was bishop?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so I think I just remember thinking even back then, like, people aren't always who they say they are. So how can I just meet a guy and magically know? Like, it started to freak me out more than anything, I think. But I was also really angry at God because I was like, why did you put this in my blessing? What, like, it just made me so, I just felt betrayed, I think, because I was like, hey, I'm not going to give any more time to like these little miracle things I'm supposed to be doing. Like, let me just focus, you know? So I was like, I'm going to get married. I married someone that I had been friends with before I left on my mission. And he's a very, very good person. We're not married anymore, but he's a good guy.
But you just threw away this idea of you'll get some spiritual confirmation that he's the one you committed to in the preexistence.
Yeah.
You said it was like rebellion. You're just like, I'm throwing that part of my patriarchal blessing away?
Totally.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, and I was also mad because I was like starting to wonder, what did that patriarch even mean? Like, they're not even supposed to tell people stuff like that anymore. Like, some people had told me like, oh, they're not supposed to say stuff like that in your patriarchal blessing anymore.
Which I think is true.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I remember being like, okay, so I can either believe my patriarchal blessing and just hope I get this random manifestation one day. But I had already experienced that with my missionary where he had tried to tell me, you're supposed to marry me. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to be the freak going up to some guy and being like, I think we're supposed to get married. Like, what? That's just so weird.
Yeah.
And so I think it was rebellion of just like, well, God, I'm not going to test this one. I'm not even going to test it because I've already tested you so many times on this stuff and nothing happened. And so I was like, I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to get married to a good person and we're just going to figure it out, which like is a mistake still in Mormonism even.
But healthy in real life.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah. To be like, hey, I want to marry someone that like I trust and like not just from some random prompting of the spirit. That's just so dangerous.
That's really just a bunch of emotions you're feeling at the time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so I remember just kind of setting that aside and being like, I'll figure that out later. And I was like, and I think I kind of convinced myself too. I was like, well, I've prayed about it and I feel good about it. It didn't happen exactly in this miraculous way, but I feel good about it. So that was the path.
Maybe that's the witness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Although that is pretty quick and early to get married. Let's not miss that, right?
Yeah.
Like, was there any part of you saying, I don't want to get married this young, this soon? Or had you just bought into, I guess you had been planning on that since high school and before.
Yeah, I had been planning this my whole life, and it didn't happen the way maybe I would have wanted, because I didn't feel a lot of like romantic feelings towards my spouse at the time. It was more of a friendship and like just really thinking he was a good person and wanting to, honestly, as I say, like it was one moment of rebellion of saying, I'm not going to test you on this, Lord. Like, I'm not going to figure out my patriarchal blessing thing. But in another way, I was testing him by saying, I'm going to get married in the temple and I'm going to see, like, is this stuff real? Like, is this really, like, if I get married in the temple and if I obey the commandments, is something going to change? Am I going to feel happier? Am I going to feel more fulfilled? Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I got married really young, and I
Temple marriage? Temple marriage.
Okay. Yep. We both had never, like, we were both virgins, didn't know what we were doing. Looking back, I'm just, it's a mistake to get married that young. And you can't tell that to like people when they're in it. You can, but like, they're not going to listen to you. So like, if someone had tried to tell me, I would have been like, F off. Like, I can do what I want. But looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, that was way too young. I didn't know what I was doing. We both had a lot of baggage just from like our childhoods and stuff that we had never talked about or confronted.
Or processed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there was just a lot going on in that relationship. And most of it was just, I'm going to get married because that's what you're supposed to do.
Okay.
And I acknowledge that I think that really hurt him because I think he really was in it for more than just church stuff. So
you're saying that you worked about a year answering phones, but you got married and needed more money. And so you were kind of looking for a promotion because you needed more money now that you're married.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that where we are? Okay. All right. So did you ask for a promotion or did you just look for new gigs? How did it work that you got promoted?
So the same website I had applied through before, you could just look and find like job openings. So I started looking for job openings specifically for full-time work because I wanted benefits. And I ended up getting a job with local unit support. And for those who don't know what that is, local unit is just referring to a branch, a ward, or a stake, and support. So it's IT support, membership support.
And branches of wards are like just congregations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Congregation support. So,
Yeah.
I mean, we would help, I'm trying to think. So like high priest group leaders, I want to say, we would help them with like home teaching reports. Like, I mean, it covered a lot of stuff. It's like we were helping bishops, we were helping finance and membership clerks. You just learn so much about the inner workings of the church, not on like a shocking story level, but just like the depth of like this software, the policies. You learn so much about the work that goes on behind the scenes to make like a baptism happen. It's a lot of work and a lot of record keeping.
So just basically anyone in a ward or a branch or stake that has questions about process, how to run things at the ward or stake level, they would call this number to get support?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's like a lot of software that the church uses. I'm sure you're familiar with like leader and clerk resources.
I'm not actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. I just assumed because I don't want to be like, yeah, I don't want to. Yeah.
And I know a lot of our listeners and viewers aren't.
Okay.
Yeah, because half have never been Mormon.
So leader and clerk resources, it's LCR. It's an online software that's connected to like your LDS account. So like your online account that you sign into, attached to your account is like your calling. And based on your calling, you have access to like certain pieces of software. So like CDAL, I think I've seen you talk about CDAL before, like the Church Directory of Organizations and Leaders.
Nope.
Oh, dang.
Don't
Okay.
know about it.
Maybe
Tell me all about it.
Maybe it's a mistake to bring this stuff up, but everyone knows about it. Like bishops and like stake presidents, they all have access to this.
So CDAL is like an organizational chart or what?
It's like a directory that you can search through. So like, let's say there's a bishop and he wants to call like a previous bishop of yours and just find out like what you're like, get like, and he's like, hey, I need to call this other bishop just to say, hey, a guy moved in from your ward. Tell me about him. Does he have any problems? Like, would he be good for this calling type of stuff? So yeah, there's a lot about that. So like even just updating that directory. So this is like even more in depth than like LDS tools, which like all members would have access to. It's like just for leaders. And like you could even theoretically, I think, look up like Area 70s in there or like mission presidents and their contact information. But yeah, all stake presidents and bishops, maybe ward clerks, but yeah, there's a lot of leaders that have access to that. Leader and clerk resources is like the software that replaced, was it MLS? Which was like in every church building, there was like this software on the computer that you use to record tithing, to record like baptisms, boring administrative stuff. But leader and clerk resources was cool because then you could start doing all of that work like at home instead of having to be in the ward clerk's office, like doing stuff on this specific church computer, if that makes sense. So I had to become an expert on like all of these systems. And those two that I mentioned are 2 out of like probably 15 pieces of software that I could tell you about.
Isn't there software when they collect the tithing each week and they have to donate it or deposit it or whatever?
Yeah, so that's MLS was the old software, and I think even some places were still using it. But Leader and Clerk Resources became like the online central place to do a lot of the record keeping. And again, it was so convenient because instead of having to drive, because remember, outside of Utah, some of these church buildings are 40 minutes away.
Yeah.
So you'd have ward clerks making this trek out to the church building to do their work. And it's so much time. I remember ward clerks would call me on holidays, like on most of the Monday federal holidays. So like Memorial Day, like 4th of July and stuff like that, they'd be like, yep, came over to do my work because it's my day off. And I'm like, on your day off, you're coming all the way here to like you're driving all the way out to your church building to do your calling. Anyways, it was just a really big blessing, I think, for people to be able to do all of that at home just from their home computer.
Okay. So what was it like working in that promotion, basically?
I really liked the work in a lot of ways. It was very fulfilling. It was very different from my mission, and that's why I loved it so much, because like you're getting calls from people who actually want help. So like it's a bishop, he's like, I've been working on this, I can't figure it out. How do I change this birth date on a record? Or like some simple stuff like that. But because people were coming to me for help, instead of me like insisting, you need my help, like let me help you get baptized. Like instead it's like people coming to me and saying, I don't know this software, I don't know these policies, can you explain this to me? And that was really empowering for me for a time.
And you could help them because you knew the answers.
Exactly. Yeah. And I became like an expert in all of that stuff. It was very, very rewarding. There were some things that I think bothered me during my time working there. For example, I felt like the church really focused on their like on the units in the United States and like offering them support. But sometimes for like globally, when it was like someone calling from like Germany or Guatemala or somewhere, I just felt like sometimes there wasn't a lot of support for them. Because I didn't know everything about the church. Even though I knew a lot, there were some questions I couldn't answer and no one else could answer them either. And I would get really frustrated because I'm like, well, it's a global church. Like, we should have support for these guys. Like, I get that all of your tithing comes from the United States. I get that, like, the bulk of, like, your members and stakes and stuff are here. But you have more members outside of the United States than in the United States, you know? And so that was frustrating for me. And I remember just, like, running into a couple of hiccups where I was like, why don't we have better support for these guys that are, like, that are in the trenches, really, taking buses. I mean, they're paying like bus fares to get to their church buildings, to call us and ask questions about their software. And when we don't have answers, that's a whole bus trip wasted. Like, I really want to paint that picture for people outside of Utah, especially. Like, if you have a problem with like the church computer or like the church Wi-Fi or church IT in some way, right? So for example, like general conference broadcasts, and everyone's going to your church building to like see a broadcast. Why don't we have better support for these guys? Because like I said, they're doing a 1-hour bus fare to get to the church and then to call us and ask these questions. And when we send them in circles or when we don't have very good answers for them, that's such a waste of time. And it really bothered me. I know that those people really cared and believed in the work. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes it was frustrating for me to see how much money was being spent on like my own employment, for example. Like, I felt like I made pretty good money for the time, and to feel like these people were sacrificing so much just to go to a church building and call us. And then here I am sitting at a desk in church headquarters, like making so much money, and like their tithing was going to pay for that. There was just some weird disconnects that I would feel sometimes of like even regular bishops, not in other countries, seeing all of the work they were putting in, unpaid work. And here I am at church headquarters making money and having a salary. And I was like, something just feels weird about this to me. So
I heard you talk about sometimes not being fully honest with, for example, bishops. Did that, and the patriarchal blessing example, mm-hmm. was that during this position? Or
yes.
Do you want to tell stories about when you were sad that you couldn't just be straight up with bishops?
Yeah. So bishops spend a lot of their time pretty much in the dark. Like, I want to say, like, I know so many members think their bishops are like privy to like this like confidential information from the church, but the church is so limited in what they tell even bishops.
They're not really trained. There's not really any training for bishops.
Right. So they're calling just a regular guy, like a lay member, and saying, hey, you're now in charge of the salvation of an entire ward, and it's such a big time commitment. They really care, though, about those people. And so I would have people, I'd have bishops calling, and they would say, hey, one of my members got excommunicated. And they would say, I would love to send them their patriarchal blessing, like a copy of it. And how can we do that? And instead of telling them that excommunicated members can't get a copy of their patriarchal blessing.
Because that's the policy?
That's a policy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They're not allowed to have access to it for some reason. And instead of just telling a bishop that so that he stops like going on a wild goose chase, we would send him to like another online portal to fill out a form, like to ask to get a copy of it. But it would go nowhere because he can't get a copy of it. So it just felt so useless to me. And they care a lot about the people that they're helping. And so I felt like I was almost being instructed not to meet the bishops where they were at because they want to help. And I can't meet them in that same energy of wanting to help. I have to send them on this weird, like, wild goose chase of just, yeah, you can request the patriarchal blessing. Go ahead. Like, go to this form and go request it. And that just felt so wrong to me, like being asked to lie, basically. And like, you're not lying. You're just saying, okay, the way you're not lying, like it's a lie, but like the way you justify it in your mind is you're just telling him the proper way to go about like requesting that. But it's
even though you know they can't get it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Any other thing about that job? Frustrating, testimony harming, problematic that you remember in that second position?
I remember fast offerings was like a very, very mind-opening topic for me in a good way. The church does not put a limit on bishops really on how much they're allowed to help members, like as far as monetary stuff. Like I'm sure there's an amount that if it got flagged or something like in their banking system, like they would talk to the bishop about it. But for the most part, like our policy was if you feel like this member needs that help, go for it.
Like pay their rent, pay their mortgage, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I saw some really, really beautiful things. Like, and I just imagined like bishops meeting with these members every week, like every Sunday I would think about it. Bishops meeting with people who needed help and taking that money and writing out checks for their utilities, for their car payment, for various things. And there's obviously some darker things with it where it's like, yeah, you have to be a member, you have to be going to church. Like they're very weird about giving that help to non-members. So that's like kind of a negative side of it. But to see that happening, and like I had access to see like all of the like fast offering help that one ward would do in a week. And that was really beautiful to me, just to see like the care and concern that bishops had and like to see where your money is going. And I know that the money also goes to a lot of places that we don't want it to go, right? Like City Creek and all this stuff. But I couldn't deny that there was some good being done, and that really changed me. I even had a bishop call me once from South America, and he was saying, hey, can I buy these kids a mattress? And he was afraid that if he bought them a mattress, he would get in trouble because they're really expensive. And it was in South America. And I remember just saying, Bishop, like, if you think they need a mattress, like, you can buy them one. That's totally okay. And he's like, oh, I forgot, hermana. Like, he called me hermana. And he's like, in the United States, like that's probably not a lot of money to you, but to us, it's a lot of money. And he had just described like these kids sleeping on the floor and said that they're just living in really bad conditions. And he's like, I just have to buy them a mattress. But he called church headquarters to ask. And that was like another thing is I think there's so much mystery and like the church kind of keeps leaders in the dark because they don't want them to get away with too much, if that makes sense. Like they kind of want them to live in a little bit of fear of like, oh, I don't want church headquarters mad at me. And I think that kind of takes away from the work that they're doing because I think the average bishop just genuinely wants to help people. I don't think he wants to worry about church headquarters breathing down his neck about things. So the fact that he felt like he had to call us and ask permission was really telling. But yeah, that was something that I saw that really stood out to me.
I remember when I was a branch president on my mission in Guatemala, we had to disfellowship a former branch president for embezzling funds. Did you ever have visibility into that type of thing of like bishops and branch presidents stealing money from the church?
Mm-hmm. Man, there are some things I really want to say, but I'm really nervous. Just because, maybe I'll tell you after, but I saw, I'll just put it this way. The church is very, very generous and merciful in some cases when people embezzle money. I'll say that. And just like, yes, you'll get disfellowshipped, you'll get excommunicated, you'll never have access to church funds ever again. But I saw some things that made me really, I was surprised at some of the compassion that I would see in those situations.
Sounds like they could have put some people in jail and were more, and that could be because they're really kind and compassionate, or because they didn't want it getting out that funds weren't being taken care of, that funds are being embezzled.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily kindness, but it could be kindness.
Yeah. And that's part of it, right? As I was working for the church, I interpreted it as kindness, but who knows higher up what the reasoning is for that, right? You don't really know. So at my point in the church and in my journey, that's how I interpreted it. But again, like you said, who knows what the real reasoning is?
Yeah. So because you literally never hear about the church pressing charges for fraud against someone who stole money from the church. You actually don't ever hear about that. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the church has learned it's better to keep that out of the legal system if there's embezzlement.
Yeah. And again, who knows why that is, but I know that's the case.
Interesting.
There were a lot of instances of embezzlement that I saw, and it was normally happening in like poorer areas. So
yeah, where the branch president's super poor and can't make ends meet because they're not getting paid because they're giving free labor to the church, right?
Exactly. Well, and I'm sure you're seeing conference broadcasts. Like you see the buildings in downtown Salt Lake and all these massive, it's so clear that the church is massively wealthy. Yeah. And so how can you blame a branch president or some leader who's very, very poor saying, well, I want to take some of this money? Like I can't really blame someone for feeling that way when they're in such poor circumstances, because the church has so much.
I could see a bishop in a developing country getting a mattress for some kids in his branch when maybe he or his kids aren't necessarily sleeping on good mattresses.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I'm sure that happened, Yeah. So I think it's a really, really big, I don't want to say temptation because that makes it sound like a bad thing, because I think it's more just a human thing, right? To see this organization with so much money and to think, well, they're not really going to miss this if I take it, But the church finds out so quick. Like you cannot get away with it for very long as a bishop or a branch president. They have a lot of controls around that. So
anything else in that second position that started dinking away at your testimony? Or was your testimony still pretty strong at that point?
I would say, I think my testimony was pretty strong, except, I was very depressed. So I told you I, gave up theater after high school and stuff. And so there was, this sense of, okay, I'm doing everything right. And, I'm having some good experiences working for the church, but I don't feel happy still. And I'm married in the temple, and I'm not happy still. So why? Why am I still not happy? And, of course, the theme so far in my life has been, okay, mission, I'm the garbage one. It's not the message that's garbage. And so I think I was still kind of trying to hold on to that narrative of well, it has to be me. I have to be the problem. But it was kind of starting to dwindle a little bit of just, okay, but can it really be me if it's still after all this time, I'm still not seeing any results, So that leads me to the next part, which was my time in confidential records.
Okay.
That's where everything changed for me. I went from a job that was pretty fulfilling and pretty fun, and it was really hard work, but it was very fulfilling, and it didn't really shatter my testimony at all. And then suddenly I'm in a position that's just, the only way I can really describe it is just very dark. So in confidential records, there's a group that handles applications to the first presidency. So like restoration of blessings, sealing cancellations, sealing clearances. And then there's another group, which was my group, that processed disciplinary councils, name removals, I think, and like we took phone calls from bishops who had questions too.
Okay, so that first list again, sealing cancellations for never Mormons. That's when you were married in the temple for eternity, but then you need to get divorced. And if you're a man, you just get to go on and get sealed to other women for eternity in the temple, and there's no problem, right? But if you're a woman, you have to request that your sealing, eternal sealing to your husband gets canceled so that then you can get married to another man. Did I get that right?
So the cancellation part, yeah, it's interesting though, because when a man gets married and sealed and then divorced, he actually does need a sealing clearance to be sealed again.
Clearance, not a cancellation.
So he can be sealed to multiple women, like you're saying, which is so weird. But he does actually need to go through a process again with
good.
The first presidency.
Yeah,
it is good. Like it's nice that they actually do have to go through some hoops and stuff.
So what else was in that department?
Restoration of blessings, sealing cancellation, sealing
restoration of blessings. That's when you've been excommunicated or disfellowshipped, and now it's time to get full membership status back. Is that right?
Yeah. So when someone's excommunicated, and there's different terminology for it now. I haven't bothered to learn it. But when I was working there, it was when you're excommunicated, if you've been sealed or if you had gotten your endowment, when you're rebaptized, those blessings, those like ceremonies and stuff aren't automatically reinstated. So when you're baptized, you have like membership status again, but you have to wait a whole other year before you can get your restoration of blessings. And restoration of blessings is like kind of just restoring your endowment and your sealing and stuff like that.
Okay.
So, and it was based on applications to the first presidency. So I don't think everyone who got a restoration of blessings needed first presidency approval. It was just in certain situations, like with child abuse and stuff, where you'd need approval.
Now, you didn't work in that department, is that right?
So it's all the same department,
Okay.
but we are kind of two divisions almost.
So you weren't in that division?
I wasn't in that division.
So really quickly, why are they petitioning the first presidency? I'm guessing the first presidency never looks at those petitions. Am I right? That it's bureaucrats that process those
The first presidency would read a summary. And I don't know if that's true because I never was in the room when they did it. But the word was the first presidency would read the summary of the application. So saying, okay, it's so-and-so, here's a summary of their situation.
Like I molested a child, but now I'm repented. Can I get my full rights back?
Yeah, stuff like that.
Okay. So your division was responsible for what? You said excommunications. And
so
discipline.
Reading disciplinary council documents and reading name removal letters and processing name removals.
Okay. So tell us about that role now that we've talked all about it around it. Yeah.
So my job was, I would take phone calls from bishops and stake presidents asking questions about the disciplinary process, because leaders really don't hold that many councils in the time that at least they shouldn't. They don't hold that many councils in their time in that calling usually. And so sometimes they would have questions about the process or like procedures or policies around it, and we would just answer those questions. But like the bulk of my work was phone calls, but also reading disciplinary council documents. And I think that's really, it just so much blew open for me when I started doing that, because your whole life, you're kind of in the church, you're made to feel like shit for really small things, like losing your temper, or, even for teenagers and stuff, masturbation and pornography, or even adult men also like so shamed and so like looked down on for engaging in any of that. And suddenly I'm reading all these disciplinary council documents about really bad stuff, most of it. Some of it was like minor, but most of it I was like, like, I mean, you'd read about spousal abuse, but like horrific spousal abuse, child abuse, murder, like so many horrible things. And I mean, pretty quickly I was like, oh my gosh, all this stuff I've ever been made to feel bad about isn't actually that bad. Like, there are real people out there who have done horrible things that I just had no idea. And so pretty quickly I was like, okay, I don't think that like all these little sexual sins are bad. I just don't. I've seen it with my own two eyes, like the harm that's done to kids when child abuse is happening. I've seen firsthand, like by reading these accounts, like the harm that comes from like assault and things like that, like non-consensual things. But I couldn't believe anymore that the rest of it was bad. Like I would read about like, yeah, this guy, he got back from his mission and he had sex with his girlfriend. And I'm like, I'm reading this after reading a child abuse case. And I'm just like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care that he did that. I don't think it's a harmful thing. I think the more harmful thing is like the shame that the church puts on people over this stuff. I don't think it's normal to shame people for it. And for me, reading all of this stuff and you start to see patterns. So like I could tell you a story, but it's like 100 people's stories, right? So like someone could be watching this and be like, that's my story. And I'm like, no, that's happened all the time. Like people just coming home from their missions, you know, breaking the law of chastity and then getting disciplined for it.
Yeah. So if you've been endowed, you've been on a mission and you have premarital sex, plenty of people have been excommunicated just for that.
Oh, yeah.
Basically premarital sex, right?
Yeah.
But then also if you have an affair on your spouse and you're caught, you can be excommunicated for that. But you can also not be excommunicated depending on who you know and who your leaders are, correct?
Yeah, and what your bishop thinks and what your stake president thinks. Yeah.
But then, and then also if you're a public figure, the church might be less likely to excommunicate you as long as lots of people don't know about it. Because, you know, they don't want to have a big scandal happen, right?
Right.
But if everyone knows about it, then they may have to excommunicate you because it's a public thing and they don't want you to, anyone to think that they're being lenient. So,
right.
But then also you can get excommunicated for being gay, right? For having sex as a gay person, right?
Yeah. I mean, gay marriage. So like, I would process like a horrific child abuse case, right? Like on one day, like I'm processing like, I mean, just horrible, like details I will never repeat to anyone because it's like that bad.
What does it mean to process? What do you mean? You would read the letter and what?
So the bishop would upload like all of the council documents and proceedings into leader and clerk resources we talked about earlier. And that information would be sent to church headquarters. But just because he sends it to headquarters doesn't mean, oh, now the member's excommunicated. We were actually on the back end processing that stuff. So bishop excommunicates someone, sends the documents to us, and the member's kind of hanging out in limbo until we read it all and make sure it was done correctly. And then we go ahead and process the excommunication, like actually update the record to be like, hey, this is an excommunicated person.
Okay, so y'all are the ones that change the field from member in good standing to disfellowshipped or no longer a member.
Yeah.
After you've read all the documents and made sure it's all processed. Okay, so you would learn about horrific child abusers.
Yeah.
Being excommunicated. Go ahead and.
Yeah, and then so I'd move from that case, right, and then I'd be like, hey, here's my next excommunication, and it would be like, so-and-so has been inactive for 10 years and we just found out that he's been married to a man, and they're like, so we're excommunicating him. And it just sat so wrong with me because here I was reading about real harm happening. And I agreed, like I would agree. I'd be like, okay, cool. Yeah. Excommunicate this person that's abusing children. We would annotate the record and I would feel good about that. Like that's the proper way to go. But then I would move on to the next one. And when you're seeing something so almost like it doesn't mean anything to me. Like that this person, like who cares that he married the love of his life, in
Especially
a gay marriage.
Especially if he's inactive.
Yes.
Why bother him?
Exactly. And so they're like, we held the council without him and like blah, blah, blah. And he's excommunicated now. And I just thought to myself, like, do I think God cares? Like God is so intimately aware of the harm that people do to each other. How is it even remotely possible that he sees the harm happening to a kid and someone marrying, like entering a gay marriage? How is that the same in levels of severity? And I couldn't find a way to reconcile it. I remember like it was almost overnight just waking up one day and being like, I actually don't think that's wrong. And I've never thought it was wrong. It was buried underneath all of this shame and all of these ideas that the church gave me. But I just couldn't believe it anymore. I couldn't believe that it was wrong to marry somebody that's your same sex or gender or whatever.
Or even, I often have heard about, like, let's say a woman and a man get divorced and they kind of aren't in the church because it's really hard to be divorced in the church. Mm-hmm. And then 5 years later, the woman's just dating and she has a boyfriend and he's never been Mormon, and they have sex. But then like nosy neighbors are like, wait a minute, she's got a boyfriend. And then the bishop's just excommunicating this adult woman who has a normal, healthy adult relationship, but they're going after her. Oh, wait, you're living with your boyfriend? Oh, well, then we got to excommunicate you, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Right?
And it was like so weird because I consider myself like a very faithful member of the church that believed in all of this stuff. But once you start seeing real harm, and then you see things that don't bother anyone, it's just a bunch of busybodies, right? That are like, oh, well, they got married and we found out that he married his boyfriend. Who cares, man? Like, yeah. And I couldn't believe that God would care because I'm like, no. Me and God have the same information. Like, I'm privy to all of this information. God supposedly has this same information. And there's no way that he would be on board with these people getting excommunicated for nothing. Mm-hmm. Like you're saying, like a consensual, happy relationship. I couldn't believe it anymore.
So, okay, can I don't want to push you per se, but can I ask you a couple questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like, okay, one thing that didn't make sense when I heard you talk about this, it can all be bad. So there is logically, it seems within the world of reason that there can be kind of a minimum bar for worthiness. And while murder or, same-sex marriage or child abuse can be really bad, that because it's Mormon doctrine that any extramarital sex is a sin next to murder, that, fresh off your mission, sex with your girlfriend or sex for a single woman who's an adult who has a boyfriend, that still is a sin next to murder and is below the threshold of minimal worthiness to be a member. That can be true as a believing Orthodox Mormon, and while also still recognizing that same-sex marriage or pedophilia can be like way, way, way worse. So I can see you reaching the conclusion that like these things like same-sex marriage or single sex or divorced woman having sex, these things aren't harming anyone, so I don't like that. But it doesn't make sense to say that just because A, B, and C sins are really, really bad, but X, Y, and Z sins are still bad, but not as bad as A, B, and C sins, that they all are beyond the pale in terms of God's standards for membership. Do you see what I'm asking? I don't totally get that logic.
So,
because it is sin next to murder. Any according to Mormons, any marriage that isn't between a man and a woman who are legally married is a sin next to murder.
So well, are you asking about like the church's perspective on this or my perspective?
Yours.
While I was working there.
Yeah, because like to say, I can see you saying who gets hurt when two men get married? I can understand that. Mm-hmm. That shouldn't be excommunicating, because they're not hurting anyone. Mm-hmm. I can understand that.
Yeah.
But the logic of, wait, a returned missionary having sex is not as bad as pedophilia. Therefore, they shouldn't get excommunicated. They shouldn't both be excommunicated. That's the logic I don't quite understand. Because from a church's perspective,
it's all bad.
It's all below the minimum requirement for membership.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to call you on everything being perfectly rational, but can you see why that?
Totally. So
it's still a sin next to murder, according to the church.
Right. So I think, honestly, what happened for me is instead of saying, oh, God said so, and that's why we have these commandments, and I still believe that those are real commandments, I started just asking myself, where is the harm? And so I think, I deconstructed pretty quickly the idea that, same-sex marriage is harmful, because I didn't think it was anymore. And I deconstructed these ideas that any kind of consensual sex between two adults, I just didn't care. And so I really deconstructed
Got it.
all of it all at once. So it wasn't in degrees, really. I wasn't still yeah, but God's right about some of the law of chastity. Obviously with pedophilia, that's definitely a violation of the law of chastity. I still believed that was wrong because I saw the harm. But this other stuff, I just started viewing it through a lens of, okay, but who's being harmed by this? And I couldn't find anyone being harmed.
So it just got you thinking about what's really bad, given that these stakes were so high, and you started questioning the church's conclusion that certain behaviors were horrific.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, got it.
And I would even see things where, it was so frustrating, but I would see situations where a convert went on a mission, came back, had sex with his girlfriend, but he's the only member in his family. And they would excommunicate him for one time doing something like that. And it's where's the mercy, man? This guy is the only member in his family. He already sacrificed 2 years of his life for the church. That's just so low, And then I would see other situations, I'm not joking, where a church leader would call us and say, I feel like disfellowshipment is too harsh for this child abuser. And it's I
was going to ask you that next.
Yeah.
So did you ever see child abusers either get not excommunicated or not disfellowshipped and kind of set free? Because that's my understanding, is that the church tends to not want to excommunicate its child abusers, which is crazy.
So it's really frustrating because I would get phone calls, like I said. So to give you some context, the policy is when child abuse occurs, you have to hold a disciplinary council. That's the rule. You hold a disciplinary council, and it has to result in either disfellowshipment or excommunication. There is no other option. You can't just be oh, we won't do anything. You have to do one of those outcomes.
Okay.
So I would be seeing situations where, for example, returned missionary kid has sex once, gets excommunicated. Other guy abuses a kid for 5 years and gets disfellowshipped.
Okay, that's outrageous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so bishop roulette, right? or stake president roulette. It's just a matter of these bishops and these leaders not really understanding the gravity of these sins. How is, in what world, if God's church is real, how is a kid getting excommunicated for having sex once, but then a child abuser is getting disfellowshipped? Come on. Come on.
And I don't know how much this makes sense to you, but if I'm trying to make sense of that, what we know for sure is that the hotline that bishops are supposed to call goes to Kurt McConkie. And what we know for sure is that historically Kurt McConkie tells bishops, don't tell the police, don't go to law enforcement. We handle this amongst ourselves. It makes perfect sense to me that if you excommunicate a child abuser, everyone in the ward knows, because now they can't do anything, and he's no longer even on the rolls or the records of the church. And it would also potentially be a flag to get law enforcement involved or whatever. So it would seem to me if the goal of the church was to minimize lawsuits, minimize any legal, any liability, any awareness of the legal system, they would want child abusers to be hush-hush, handled quietly in a way where people didn't know. And then if you add to that, if the bishops abusing a child or the Relief Society president or the Elders Quorum president, the bishop would have called them to their leadership position, or even a Boy Scout leader, young men's leader, or a young women's leader. The bishop would have called them to that position. So then if they get, if everyone finds out that they are a child abuser, then the bishop clearly wasn't inspired when he made that call. So for all those reasons, I could see why Kurt McConkie, the lawyers, and the PR people in the church would be disincentivized to have those people, those abusers, be excommunicated, just to keep it clean and tidy and dealt with. So that's my thinking about why you would get these calls, you know, or you would see the result be disfellowshipment, not excommunication.
Yeah, I think you're really onto something. I was never privy to like those conversations, so I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think you're definitely onto something, that they want to keep it pretty quiet, because nobody, like no PR team wants people to know that there are members who are abusing kids walking among you at church, you know. But it was really frustrating to see, like we would have bishops call us sometimes, and they would say, hey, we don't want to disfellowship them even. We just want to put them on something called formal probation, which is a very, very small sentence.
It's like a slap on the wrist.
Yes, like barely anything. Like church headquarters doesn't even keep track of formal probation records. That's how minimal it is. It's like just a thing that happens, and then you go on your merry way.
It's like, don't take the sacrament for a couple of weeks. Let me have your temple recommend
months.
for, you know.
Yeah, it's very, very minimal.
Mm-hmm.
And we would have bishops call and say, well, I want to just put them on formal probation. And we're like, Bishop, you can't. Like, the policy is they have to be disfellowshipped or excommunicated. Like, that's how serious it is.
And again, you're talking child abusers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. But like the fact that we would even get bishops calling and trying to do formal probation, like we would talk about it as coworkers. We would be like, I just got a call from a bishop who wants to put a child abuser on formal probation. And we would all just be like, you're joking me. Like, that's crazy. But it happened a lot. Like, we would even have bishops call us and they're like, well, the council's already been held and that's what we decided. And we would be like, yeah, man, you got to hold the council again, because it's invalid. Like, it's an invalid council at that point if you're not following the procedures and policies. So it was frustrating. And I think too, though, I don't think that the church culture has always been what it has kind of shifted to, which is they do take child abuse more seriously now. And I know there's still a lot of issues, so I'm not saying they're doing great now, but I think it was worse. And now they've kind of shifted, but you can still see with some of the older leaders this attitude of, well, it's not a big deal. He's repented. He feels contrite. And it's like, yeah, sorry, dude. Like, you have to disfellowship or excommunicate him.
Did you say you got calls from people, like leaders, saying disfellowshipment's too harsh?
Mm-hmm. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So bishops would call us and just say, hey,
bishops.
or stake presidents, and they'd say, hey, this. Well, so for example, I think even in the system when they're recording it, if they mark on there that this person abused kids, it won't even let you select formal probation as an option. And so they would call us thinking there's a glitch, and we would say, no, it's not a glitch. It's that you literally cannot have the outcome be formal probation. But they would want that. They would say, well, we already held the council, or disfellowshipment was too harsh in our minds. And we're like, well, no, like, it's child abuse. Like, you have to be more harsh in these situations. So that was really frustrating for me and for all of us, I think, just bishops who didn't understand that.
Well, it must have just been weird that excommunication wasn't mandatory for all child abusers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like what's worse? Imagine what's the worst thing other than murder? What's worse than child abuse?
Yeah, like tie a millstone around their neck type of thing. That's what Jesus said to do. Yeah. And so, yeah, it really, really bothered me I mean, I don't think I thought about it in those terms of like, oh, every child abuse situation should result in excommunication. But I was very bothered by the varying outcomes for like different levels of sin. Like I told you, like sex one time, you get excommunicated. But then this other guy, the bishop's calling to advocate for him and wants to just put him on formal probation like a child abuser.
Who may have abused multiple kids over multiple years, right?
Yes. And like sometimes we would find out later that they didn't confess everything and that it had been going on for years and years. Like so much secrecy and there's a lot to be said about the culture of abuse, like enabling abuse and perpetrating abuse that the church creates. And so these people get caught up in it and they're caught up in so much secrecy and shame that they don't confess all of it all the way. But the way it was handled sometimes was just really concerning.
So I have a couple more questions. I apologize. So the first is, like, I used to, so you were working for the church when the November 2015 policy hit.
Yes, I was not in that department, but I was working for the church, yes.
And one of the points I would make is once same-sex marriage was legalized nationwide as part of the Obergefell Supreme Court decision, the church came out with this policy saying you must hold a disciplinary council on same-sex married couples. And I believe the policy was at the time that excommunication is mandatory. So what I was telling people was that according to the Mormon Church, getting legally same-sex married to the person you love is a worse sin than child abuse or spousal abuse. Was I right?
So I would have to look back at the handbook and see what the policy was, but I think it was excommunication because it's like, well, how do you even come back? Like, do you make them get divorced? Like, I think they just didn't know how to handle it. And so they just said you have to excommunicate them. They can't be members while they're married.
Yeah, because they went on to say that the children of same-sex married couples couldn't even, get baptized or advance in the priesthood or even become a member until they're 18, and then only if they denounced their own parents' same-sex marriage. So, I mean, if they're not letting even the kids get baptized, they're going to be excommunicating the parents.
Yeah, and so exactly like you're saying, like in the church's eyes, same-sex marriage between two consenting adults who aren't hurting anybody is a worse sin than child abuse.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
Okay. So did the sheer number of, instances of child abuse or infidelity or premarital sex, just seeing the volume of that as someone who's processing the disciplinary council outcomes, did that shock you or affect you at all? Just seeing the
definitely
prevalence.
Did.
Yeah.
So I remember I was just sitting at my desk one day and it dawned on me like all at once, like, and I knew it was true with all my heart. It just dawned on me. I was like, oh my God, every single man in the church has watched porn. Like I just knew
porn?
it.
What does that have to do with?
So in the disciplinary councils, they would talk about porn, right? And they would mark that as like one of the sins. And every man who ever came through, even if it was for like embezzlement or something, or like they'd committed fraud at their company, every time it was like, and they watched porn. And so I just started thinking, I was like, if every council I'm reading, every single one mentions porn, everyone's watched it. And like, for me, that was a huge revelation. Like, I know with some men, like they're introduced to porn, like at youth conference or at scout camp or whatever, like on a cell phone or a magazine or something. But I did not know that anyone was doing that. Like, it was like a dark sin that only a couple of people had ever done. And I remember like realizing, like, even people who are in good standing in the church and don't have councils, like I was like, there is no way that every council I have ever processed mentions porn and that it's not like this huge thing that everyone's doing. Yeah.
that they're the only ones.
Yes. Yeah. And like, even, I don't want to talk about my ex-spouse too much, but like, even he had like watched it a couple times and told me about it. And I remember at the time being like, oh man, that's like such a big sin. And now I'm like, I don't care at all about that stuff. But like, but I remember just like it hit me all at once. And I think like one of the biggest gifts that Confidential Records gave me was seeing things as they really are. So I went from thinking porn was like this really out there dark thing that like nobody except the bad people had done, to like it was like this moment of like relief and acceptance of like, oh my God, everyone has done this. And I hadn't, because I don't know why I'd never been exposed to it, but like realizing that it was such a human experience that so many people had gone through, it was so liberating. And it was like just this moment of truth that hit me. And I was like, okay, so if everybody's done it, is everybody bad? And that was like just this huge... And it goes back to like what I learned on my mission, like, are immigrants bad? Like, are these things I've been told that are just so normal, so human, are they bad?
Are you bad?
Am I bad? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I couldn't believe that people doing that were bad anymore, because I was like, if it's a human experience, it's a human experience, and I can't shame people for that. And that changed so much for me, was just approaching the questions and those scenarios in that way. I just started feeling horrible for everyone I knew that had ever been shamed about pornography. And again, that wasn't anything I'd ever experienced, because I didn't watch it. I hadn't been exposed to it. But I just started thinking like, wow, all of these guys I was reading about at the age of 10 or 11 is when they started watching it. And for some of them, the shame was so much that I think it led them down worse paths, like especially child abuse. Like it was like, oh yeah, he started watching child porn, and then it would lead to something like horrible things. And it just kind of showed me how the shame cycle played a huge role in some of this. And so I just started thinking about the people I knew who had like felt so terrible about their porn use. And it really, again, it just made me more empathetic of how can I judge somebody for this thing that they were exposed to, and now they watch it, and now that I'm like here in 2025, I think it's a very normal thing. I think it's totally fine. Like, you know, my current partner, like we talk about that stuff, and I'm like, yeah, do whatever you want. It's like that has nothing to do with me. There's nothing wrong with it. And just at that time, like for me to have that empathy, because you're told it's the plague. You're told that pornography is a plague sweeping the earth and that you need to avoid it. And so for me to like go through that journey of just accepting it, this thing that's so ugly and terrible and awful and dark, it was like it just walked into the room and I could just say, hello, like you've always been there. Like, and I accept you. I accept that this is what the human experience is. And I found myself doing that quite a bit with everything I was reading about. People who, you know, who had premarital sex and things. I was like, oh, a normal human experience, like welcome to life, you know? And I couldn't judge them the way that I was told to judge them anymore. And that happened to me with name removals too. So you're told your whole life, like people leave the church because they're bad. And I read so many letters. We were required to read them word for word, like each letter that came in. And
these are resignations? These are people resigning?
Yes.
Okay.
So we would get handwritten letters or emails saying like, I want to remove my records. And some of them were people who were really angry, and that's also a very valid step when you leave. But there were people who would write and they would say like how betrayed they felt, how lost and sad they felt, that like they realized the church wasn't true anymore. And you read so many letters that are just so vulnerable. It's they're pouring their hearts into this. And I couldn't believe they were bad people anymore. Like, I mean, it's literally like, if God held up the stack of name removal letters that I ever wrote or that I ever read and just said, like, can you condemn these people? I would have said, no, I really can't. Like, all I'm reading here is people who are hurt, people who feel like they just can't give any more to the church. And like, who am I to blame them? I don't know. I don't know what it's like. I haven't been on that journey. And it was very powerful for me to be able to say, like, I don't think they're bad people. Because your whole life, that's all you're told, is that they're bad people and that they're wicked. And when I had their real lives in my hands and their life experiences, you can't help but love them. You can't help but say, I guess I just don't understand that part of being a human yet, and I don't understand that part of the human experience yet, but I can't judge them. I think really it came down to just asking myself, like, if God knows all this stuff that I know, would God care about these small little commandments when he actually also is holding all of this pain of the world in his hands? And I was like, no way. There's just no way. There's no way he's holding all that.
There's too much people not being perfect for God to care about every little thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
It's just too common.
Yes. And there's way too much pain out there that's from real harm being done that he should be caring about. Like, I just couldn't believe that he would care about garments at the same time that he's supposedly caring about all these other things.
Or masturbation or beer.
Yeah, I would read about people who had like smoked weed, and I'm like, who cares? Like, obviously, like, don't drive after you smoke weed or whatever, but like, who cares? Like, it doesn't do anything to do, like, doing that isn't harmful, you know? Like, obviously do it responsibly, but like, I just couldn't believe anymore that God cared about that stuff. Because like, what I was finding as I was reading is I cared a lot about vulnerable kids, and I cared a lot about vulnerable people who had been hurt. And I didn't care about these other things that just, what harm is being done? There isn't any that I could find. Mm-hmm. So
that led to you starting to loosen up your observance of Orthodox Mormon standards.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. While you're a church employee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of my coworkers even, like, one of my coworkers would swear, like, he would say jackass all the time. And I think that was one of his ways of coping, was just, well, swearing doesn't actually hurt anyone. And I'm reading about, like, we read about some horrible stuff, like, genuinely, like, really messed me up. So I was really happy to be leaving by the time I left.
Like details of child abuse?
Yeah. So like, I mean, we're talking details of child abuse, but also like details of like assault, like between spouses, but like
spousal abuse.
Yes. Yeah. But really bad stuff, like stuff where you just are like, how does the human mind even think about doing something this bad? You know?
Oh, like true crime, horrible.
Yeah. I mean, I really don't want to say details because it is that bad. Like, I don't want to just like shock factor say things, but like there were some child abuse cases that I will never forget. Like I remember who the person was, what their relationship was to the victim. I remember exactly what he said to them and how he did some of the things he did to kids, you know, to like his own nieces. And you just can't, like, that level of depravity, you just can't believe even exists inside of people. And I couldn't care about all the small stuff anymore.
So I'm really eager to get to kind of your full unraveling of your testimony to leave, but we still haven't talked about church discipline. Like, obviously, I was excommunicated. In the past, we've talked about the strengthening the church membership committee, and maybe I'll just let people know that when I was at BYU in the late 80s, early 90s, I don't know if it was Eugene England or somebody else that sort of came out publicly with the knowledge that the church had like this KGB or this CIA sort of committee that was in charge of investigating polygamists, investigating critics of the church, investigating historians, and gathering news clippings. And this is even pre-internet. But then once the internet came, gathering blog posts and podcasts or web clippings, and keeping a file, tracking members over time, keeping a file of their apostate behaviors, and then eventually, potentially, church headquarters sending those files of apostate behavior to bishops and stake presidents to sort of orchestrate their excommunications. And from as early as the 80s and 90s all the way through to my excommunication, the church always maintained, number one, they hid the committee. They didn't want anyone knowing that the Strengthening the Church Members Committee existed. It only came alight because in the news media it got reported on. But then they still, even with the September 6th and after, they wanted to maintain that every excommunication was a local decision and that the church never really was involved in the excommunication of apostates. So that's a bit of the history. And the SCMC, as it's been called, has been sort of a chilling, dark side of Mormonism that bothers a lot of people. So now let's bring your story into it. So you're working at Confidential Records. Yeah.
And my manager called me in one day and just said, hey, I'm going to start giving you some tasks. And he's like, you're going to start doing some stuff for the Strengthening Church Membership Committee. And he told me, like, in no uncertain terms, he was like, if you tell anyone about this, you will be in trouble with more than just your job. And I was like, okay.
Meaning you could get sued or whatever?
Sued, or I'm guessing like excommunicated or like, church discipline.
Okay.
That was the impression I got. Maybe he meant being sued, but I think it was more about like, you're going to be like busted.
In the church.
Like,
had you heard of the committee before he mentioned it to you?
I think I had heard whisperings of it before. And then when he told me, I was like, oh, okay, so it is a real thing. And I think, I don't remember for sure, but I think I had thought that it used to be a thing and then it wasn't anymore. And so I wasn't quite sure that if it was still like if it still existed, but it did. Yeah. And I was suddenly being tasked with some of these items and assignments. And he told me, he's like, you can't even talk to your coworkers about this. So I would be like at my desk doing some stuff and some of my coworkers would like come over and be like, what you working on? And I'm like hiding things. Like it was intense and just trying to keep it like under wraps from people. But basically, like, do you want me to talk about like the tasks I did?
Yeah, please.
So I would say the bulk of it was reading through newspaper clippings, and these newspaper clippings were sent to me from a senior missionary somewhere in church headquarters. I don't know who he was. I don't know anything. I never met him. But he would read in the Utah newspapers about crime and about just like big things that were happening in Utah, and anything that he felt like, oh, this is probably a church discipline matter, he would cut it out and I would read it. So most of it was stuff like, horrible stuff like assault, murder, like attempted murder, embezzlement. Like some people would like fraud investors out of like millions of dollars and stuff. And it would be someone who was a member of the church, So I'd get these newspaper clippings and I would have to look up if the topic, the subject matter, like the person was a member of the church. And if they were a member of the church, it was my job to scan the newspaper article and send a letter to their stake president.
And that seems like a good thing. If some guy's a child molester, but the stake or the ward don't know, but he's been busted in the legal system, you want the church notifying stake presidents and bishops so that they can take care of it.
Exactly.
So that's a good thing, right?
Totally. And that was my thought about it as well. Was yes, like even before we would send a letter to the stake president, I would just annotate the record right away. So like literally if we saw, okay, this member committed child abuse, annotation. Doesn't matter that we haven't held a disciplinary council yet. Doesn't matter anything. Like there is a recorded in the legal system, he is a child abuser. So like he is getting annotated.
And was it all crimes? Was it embezzlement? Was it fraud, MLM scams, spousal abuse, theft, murder?
Anything.
Okay.
Anything that was significant enough. There were a couple that I was like, why did they send me this newspaper clipping? So I would like have to ask my manager about it. There were like some little like scuffles over like land ownership and stuff, but like minor stuff. And usually my manager was like, don't worry about that one. But most of it was pretty like intense stuff. Like someone's going to prison for hurting somebody or for defrauding people out of money. The other part of the SCMC duties that I had that was a little darker is my manager gave me a flash drive, and on the flash drive there was an Excel spreadsheet, and the Excel spreadsheet was labeled individuals of concern. And on that list, I've had people message me and be like trying to guess who was on it, and I'm like, don't overwork yourself thinking about it, because I don't even remember all the names on it. But it was like maybe 10 to 15 names of people. You were on it, and you'd already been excommunicated at this point. Mark Noggle was on it.
He's the lawyer that processes people's excommunications.
Yes, and does it for free.
Quitmormon.com.
Yes.
Yeah.
And who else was on there? Denver Snuffer was on there, I want to say. I'm trying to think who else was on there. Everyone else that was on it was pretty inconsequential, as far as like they weren't very famous. So it was just like people that somehow church headquarters had gotten wind of, and then they found like evidence online or letters from people or something, like kind of attesting to what was being done or like the actions of these members.
I think you mentioned Sam Young was added to the list.
While I was working there, he was added to the list.
And he was just advocating against child abuse in the church as a former bishop, and he got excommunicated. So he was added while you were there. Was Bill Reel on the list, the podcaster, or you don't remember if he was on the list?
I don't remember if Bill's name was on the list, but I did end up sending, I talked about this on his show, but I was asked at one point to print out something he had posted on Facebook, and that was sent to his stake president, kind of just showing like this apostate action that he was involved in. And
that was where he called Elder Holland a liar, because he was able to find 3 or 4 examples of Elder Holland lying to the membership. And so the lie, he was accurate, but
you're not allowed to say it to thousands of people in the church's eyes.
Yeah.
Because that's when you start to be a problem.
So you were asked to inform Bill Reel's stake president that he had called Elder Holland a liar.
Publicly. Yep, to thousands of people on Facebook.
So a list of apostates, and then what were you supposed to do with that thumb drive?
Isn't that so weird? Because, like, even my manager at one point was like, I don't really know why John DeLynn is on this list. He's like, he's been excommunicated. There's nothing else we can really do, and especially, like, what, is the church going to, like, hire the mafia to take out all, like, they're not going to do that, And so I remember him just being like, I don't really know why John DeLynn's on here. And he's like, and Mark Noggle, like, he's like, that he's been out of the church forever. Like, there's nothing the church can really do at this point. Like, kind of admitting that, like, the church's hands are tied once someone's excommunicated. There's not a lot more they can do. Besides, like, maybe putting, like, some articles in church magazines that are kind of, like, poking at some of the ideas that these people represent, right?
But the fact that they were on the list meant they were still being actively investigated and followed and pursued?
Yeah, and I, like, not, like, in person, I don't think, but, like, more just, like, monitoring online, like, okay, so what are the ideas that they're talking about? What's pulling people away from the church still? What do people find interesting about them or their ideas? I think it was more about these people were involved in pulling people away from the church. And how do we combat that, right? It's called the Strengthening Church Membership Committee. So like excommunicating them, so the church publicly denouncing you is one step, right? But I think they were still trying to figure out, and my guess is that some high up guy, an apostle, a 70, someone was like, what are we going to do about all these apostates? And someone had this brilliant idea of, well, let's make a list and let's go through this list, because it just sounds so ward council to me. It's like the opposite of a ward council list of like people to minister to. It's like, who do we combat their ideas, and like, what are the steps we can take to make sure they're discredited almost, right? And so anyways, yeah, this list was basically just, what are our next steps with these people who we feel are not strengthening the church and kind of tearing it down or drawing members away, right? So that was the purpose of the list, I guess, was just to kind of identify who was pulling people away or who was sharing harmful ideas, and what can the church do to combat that. And like I said, their hands are kind of tied. It's like you can excommunicate them and that's about it,
Yeah. So what was your role with that list and with the SCMC?
So my role... So I was still doing all my confidential records duties, and then I just had like one more thing added on top of it, which was this SCMC stuff. And my job And I think they might have been trying to train me to eventually move into higher level stuff. But I was just in charge of maintaining the list. So my manager would come to me with a name. For example, Sam Young. I'm pretty sure, excuse me, I'm pretty sure Sam Young was one of the names I added to the list. And it was one of those situations where like, so this is where I was kind of privy to all of the public stuff going on, because he was like, if I remember right, he organized protests outside of church headquarters and stuff.
Yeah, he had at least two marches. Yeah.
So I remember this stuff happening while also behind closed doors having him on this list for what he was doing. And if I remember right, there were like action items on the list of like, okay, has their stake president been notified of what they're doing? And I remember Sam Young was like added to the list, and pretty quickly, like his stake president had been notified. And then within like a couple months, like he had been excommunicated. And I remember him specifically working him through that process on the list. But I wasn't very involved in the other stuff. So like, let's say the stake president had called and said, hey, I got this letter. What do I do? I wouldn't have taken that call. I would have transferred him to my manager. Like I wasn't high level enough yet to actually tell him like, yeah, the strengthening church membership or whatever. I don't know what the conversations were like, but I wasn't high level enough to do anything besides like secretarial work basically. And I would, if my manager gave me a name of somebody, he would tell me like find their website or find their social media and just like kind of summarize what they're all about. So like imagine writing up Sam Young's description and it's just he doesn't want kids to be abused. like that's just like that's so crappy.
Or like he doesn't think bishops should be sitting alone one-on-one with a 12-year-old girl asking them if they masturbate, you know? Or bishop shouldn't be sitting alone with a 16-year-old girl asking explicit sexual details about how far she went with her boyfriend, you know?
Yeah, it was very...
That's what he was advocating for.
Yes, it was so weird to write up his description, because I remember feeling like this pressure of like, well, I have to make it sound like he's doing something bad. So I'm describing it as like he's publicly opposing church procedures and policies, you know? But like, I mean, it just felt so almost empty to be like, wow, we're really going after someone for that? We're really going after them for just advocating for like better procedures that protect kids. And I think too, I might have mentioned like he wants to protect children, and like I remember my manager kind of justifying it and saying, yeah, like it's fine to want to protect kids, but you can't do it so publicly. And it's like, well, that's the only way the church has ever responded to anything, is if it's happened very publicly and very viscerally, and they're forced to respond to it. They don't respond to just like some guy in the congregation being like, I don't like the way you guys are doing this. Like they don't answer to that. It's always highly reactive for them, you know?
Yeah.
So
it's so weird that he got excommunicated, you know? Because he wasn't saying Joseph Smith wasn't a prophet. He wasn't saying the Book of Mormon wasn't true. He was just like, we need to protect children better.
It's such bad PR for the church to be like, this guy who just says, I want to help kids, we excommunicated him. And like, think about that, okay? What we were talking about earlier, the fact that some people are like disfellowshipped for abusing kids, for abusing them.
Not excommunicated.
Right. Disfellowshipped for abusing children. And Sam Young says, I think we should make it so that kids don't get abused as often in the church. Yeah. And he gets excommunicated for that. Like, it's just crazy. Yeah. Like the priorities and just the cognitive dissonance between those two things.
And what was it like for you to note the outrageousness of that weird situation, and to be thinking, wow, I'm part of this machine doing this?
Yeah, it was very weird. And I was pretty siloed. So obviously I was like managing this list and like sending out some letters to stake presidents and stuff, but like I wasn't like actually on the ground like seeing the real effects of this. And I think I was able to kind of justify it or just not think about it because it was too difficult for me to think about. And I also think this was around the time I started to be kind of physically in, mentally out. I was kind of to the point of being like, okay, I think this might just be a load of malarkey, and I'm going to stick it out because I'm making good money and I don't know what my next move is. But I don't think the church is what it says it is anymore.
So that started occurring to you.
Yeah, there's actually a story I would love to share that I haven't shared on. I didn't share it on the other show. When we would get a readmission, so we'd get readmission documents for someone who had been rebaptized, and this was after they'd been excommunicated or after they'd had their names removed. But we were required to go back and read the name removal documents. Or the original documents. So whether it was a name removal or an excommunication, we would have to go back and read the original ones. And I got a readmission for a woman who was like in her 40s. And I looked back at her excommunication documents, and they were from like the 70s or 80s. And I'm reading through these documents, and so she'd been excommunicated, and then like decades later, she's coming back. And as I'm reading these documents, I'm reading she was 14, and she'd had sexual relations with her bishop. And this was a girl who didn't have family. Her bishop let her live in his home. And I mean, so essentially groomed and raped, right? And in the 70s and 80s, whenever this was, the leaders at the time described it as she was promiscuous. She was involved in relationships with other men before the bishop. She tempted the bishop. She wasn't a good person. Like she was just like kind of describing her as a whore, like, and slut shaming this 14-year-old girl who, I mean, it's child abuse. But it was described in the documents as fornication, like as, oh, she just broke the law of chastity. That's not what the law, like, that's not fornication. Fornication is a consenting adult with another consenting adult. And so the fact that they described her as like this little whore of Babylon,
who was tempting all the men.
Yes.
Yeah, including the bishop. And
like the bishop had invited her to live with him, and then they started up this relationship. Like he was her guardian, basically. Yeah. And that was the moment for me. I'm not joking.
Well, what did you conclude from that?
That was the moment that I decided that the church actually was not divinely inspired, and that the church did not speak for God. And the reasoning is I thought to myself, this girl who was abused was excommunicated. The leaders were slut-shaming her in the disciplinary council documents and blaming her. And the bishop was also excommunicated, just for the record. But I couldn't believe anymore that these people spoke for God. Like, it's such an egregious, obvious miscarriage of justice. Like it was so, like, someone's eternal salvation, the eternal salvation of a victim. You excommunicated a victim of child abuse and made her feel like she was bad. Like, I don't think there's any coming back from that. And I remember thinking to myself, like, what has she gone through where she's coming back to the church that slut-shamed and abused her? And she's probably carried this weight her whole life. For what? She was abused. She didn't get the right help. She didn't get the right messages in that moment. Like they dropped the ball so big, like big time. And I remember asking myself, like, do I think that God would have condemned her if she never came back to church, if she had never been rebaptized? And I said, no, I don't think she would be condemned for that, because it was the church it was the church that enabled her abuse that dropped the ball. Like she is in the right, like she's the victim, she's blameless. And I didn't think that God would hold that against her at all. Like if she had never gone back to church, I think God would have said, yeah, that's totally fine. you were mistreated. And once I realized that and said, okay, so the church doesn't have a say in that girl's salvation, there's just no way. And then I started asking myself, so do they have a say in anyone's salvation? And I thought to myself, no, they don't. I can't believe it anymore. Like, if they dropped the ball on something this big, what are all the other little things that they've dropped the ball on? Like, is coffee even a big deal? Is garments a big deal? Is all this other stuff a big deal? If these church members and church leaders can sit there with no inspiration whatsoever and just say this girl is a bad person, nothing else. I couldn't believe that anything was real anymore. I couldn't believe that anything was divinely inspired. So it's horrible to read and horrible to process, but it liberated me. I mean, because I saw it with my own two eyes. Just these people who claim to speak for God and clearly were not speaking for God.
And that was clearly a big thing, but it was probably one of many things. And then maybe that just tipped your shelf. But by that point, you had a lot of other things on your shelf too. Is that right? Exactly. But that is a horrible, horrible story. And my heart goes out to her and to you. And really quickly, I want to cover a couple more things about your time at the church before we talk about your journey out, which is very important. You mentioned that missionary that had propositioned you towards the end of your mission, coming back into the story in membership records. Do you want to tell anything about that?
Yeah, we can talk about that. Because I think this was, like you said, there's so many layers to why I left. And like everything was just another card on the stack, right, of reasons. So while I was working in confidential records, that missionary who had proposed to me, I wouldn't say proposed, but he strongly suggested like we should get married type of thing. I actually got disciplinary records for him. I think maybe it was a readmission. I don't remember for sure, but when he had gotten back from his mission, he had committed child abuse. And he was excommunicated. And I remember just feeling like it was just one more thing that kind of was a disillusionment, because everyone on my mission had said this guy was like straight arrow, very faithful and good and obedient and righteous. And they were like, oh, he's like the coolest guy ever. And he goes back home and abuses a kid. And there's even more detail than that, but I don't want to I don't know how easy it would be to find out who he is. So I'm not going to say more than that. But like just the fact that this guy that everyone had set up to be like this spiritual giant and was like, oh, he's so cool, he's so close to God. And then he goes home and abuses a kid. It was just one more thing on top of the stack of like disillusionment and lies and like all these like miracles. Like it was basically smoke and mirrors. I started realizing like I was seeing through smoke and mirrors. And they didn't have any power over me anymore because I saw things again as they really were.
Okay. What about you personally reflecting on what it did to you to go through that and how it ended up ruining your faith in the church? How do you feel about that personally?
I think so on one level, I feel angry that the church keeps people in the dark, because I get a lot of really angry comments like online and other places of people just saying, well, you just left the church to sin, all the lies, right? And you didn't believe in the first place, you wanted to sin, you got offended. Mm-hmm. And because the church keeps people so much in the dark, and unless you've worked where I have worked, I think it's really easy for people to just look at me as like this poster child of like apostasy and just like an example of a sinner, you know? And I think I'm a little bit bitter that I can't just give people the same experiences that I had, that I can't just show them what I saw and prove that it was all real and that everything I went through is what contributed to this. Because I think it's really easy for people to look at me and say, well, you just wanted to sin, or you were just angry at like, I don't know, you were just angry at stupid stuff. But it's like, no, like this really changed me forever. And there was no going back. Like you can't, when your testimony is made out of like wood and it just gets burned away, like I can't rebuild that. Like I already know now. I know that like when you put the wood up to fire, there's no salvaging it, and I couldn't hold on to it anymore. And so I think I am a little bit angry just that the church lets most of the members stay in the dark about what happens and about the processes, because it makes it easier for members to hate me, right? Like people who are going to hate watch this, or people who like hate follow me online. It's easy for them to make assumptions about my journey because the church keeps them in the dark about a lot of this stuff. Like, and one of the only like pieces of consolation that I really have is I can just say, you know what, like truthfully, I know more than the average member. And that's a burden that I have to carry forever, because I can't just like force someone else to know it. They have to go through what I went through. And there's just so few people that have those experiences. So like on one hand, I am a little bit bitter and angry, but on the other hand, like all of it exists at once. On the other hand, I do feel a lot of gratitude, because what I went through and what I saw accelerated my path out of the church so quickly that I almost don't even have time to really regret that I was a member. Like I obviously I left like in my late 20s, so there's like a little bit of my 20s lost, but I have the rest of my life now. And I don't think I would have left the church if I hadn't worked for the church. Like it would have taken decades, if ever, right? I could have justified it forever and stayed in it forever. And so it was a huge gift, and most gifts also come with a little bit of a curse. And the curse is just the average person who isn't willing to listen and open their heart the way I opened my heart while I was working for the church. The average person's going to judge me for leaving or jump to all these weird conclusions about it, when really the simple answer is this was just my journey and it was my decision. And I just couldn't believe it anymore. Like I had seen too much. I had too much knowledge to have like blind faith anymore.
Wow, it's powerful. I mean, it's a bad sign where the closer you get to something, the more you want nothing to do with it, right? Yeah.
And that it's sad in the sense that I had to say goodbye to like my old self who wanted to build the kingdom. Like that's genuinely why I started. And then I just started to realize that none of it was real. Like it felt like the Truman Show, right? Where you just slowly realize like, okay, everybody's maintaining this image, but there's more going on behind the scenes, and there's got to be more than this. There has to be more than this. And that was the conclusion I came to, and that's what led me out.
So when you gave notice, did you tell them why, or did you keep that?
I kept it pretty close to the chest. So by the time I left church employment, I had been drinking a little bit with my friends. Like every few months we'd get together and I'd have a couple of drinks. And I, just because I didn't believe that alcohol was bad anymore, I was like, yeah, as long as I'm not driving drunk, as long as I'm not hurting anyone, right? Because that's what I had learned. As long as I'm not hurting anybody, I just don't see how any of these commandments are important. And I didn't tell them why I was leaving, but I do remember having a debate with myself because my temple recommend was going to expire, and temple recommends expire, if I remember right, every 2 years. And I was coming up on my 2-year mark, and I just remember thinking, I can't sit and lie. I can't. I can. I could if I wanted to, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to lie to a bishop and say, I believe all of this and I'm obeying all these commandments when I wasn't anymore. And I wanted to live a more authentic life. I was done holding up the image of being a good employee. I was done holding up the image of being a good church member. And I wanted to just be me. And I couldn't do that and sit in a temple recommend interview and lie. So that was, I put in my 2 weeks. I think I filled out, I know I filled out the exit survey. I don't remember what I talked about or anything. It was very hard for me to leave, I think, because there were so many good people in the church and in church employment that I had met. But I also just knew, I couldn't do it anymore. I needed to be done. And I had seen for myself that it wasn't serving me anymore.
I imagine walking away from the salary and the salary potential and the benefits was not easy, that you might take a financial hit.
Yeah, I want to say it was like more than a third of, like, I think I had at least like a 33% pay cut, if not more, because I ended up working at a different company for a little bit before I just quit corporate work entirely and just started doing freelance stuff. So yeah, I could not find anything that paid nearly what I was making. And so that's another thing, like, why I try not to judge church employees too much, because I'm like, well, I know how hard it is to find another job. And if you're paying a mortgage and you have kids, or you have like your wife on your health insurance and it's really good insurance, and you have family members with health problems, how could you leave that? Like, it's very, very difficult. And at great personal sacrifice, but also like with a very big reward of just being able to be myself, I left.
Yeah. And how has it been? Rebuilding a life, not only not working for the church, but without the church at all in your life, and divorce. You got divorced.
Yeah.
How long were you married?
Let me think about that. I got married in 2015. I was processing my divorce by 2019. So like 4 years about.
Okay.
I actually did get married again, but I ended up getting divorced again. It wasn't for me. So it's been like a lot of trial and error, if we're being honest. But it feels so much more real, where I can examine things and just ask myself, like, what does this do for me? Like, instead of asking, like, what can I do for God? How can I build the kingdom? How can I be more perfect? Blah, blah, blah. It's more about looking at something and just saying, like, does this bring me joy? Like, does this fulfill me? Even if it doesn't bring me joy and it's like a difficult thing, does it improve my life? And I can honestly look at like different aspects of my life instead of like trying to force it to work or trying to make it work. I can just let things go so much more easily now, instead of trying to like hold on to it so tight, So I've started, like, once I left church employment, I just leaned really, really hard into doing like all the stuff I loved in high school. So music, writing, theater, art, like all of it. I couldn't get enough. And that's what I've been doing for the past like 5 years. Is I've been writing. I make short films. In fact, I'm making a short film in a couple of weeks, and we're fundraising for it right now. It's called Ho Phase, and it's actually just like, I'm really big about like taking shame away from things. And so for me, it's my way of trying to take shame away from topics like abortion and extramarital, premarital sex and all of that, and just casual sex, I guess, because that's been something that's really important to me as I've left, is just realizing like there's more than one way to live your life, and you have control over your own body, you have autonomy, and that's been a huge theme for me since leaving. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been up to, is just trying to find my way, like, as an artist, which is what I've always wanted to do, is to do writing and storytelling and just artistic endeavors.
So, two questions I have about happiness now. I mean, you, in the earlier parts of your story, you were just talking about never feeling right, things not working out like the church had led you to think they would, and then you always turning it back on yourself and saying, you're the broken one, you're the broken one. I'm guessing you've kind of let go of that idea that you're the broken one. Yeah.
I've had to do like a lot of work in therapy. But I'll never forget, I was like in a bathroom stall at church headquarters, and I was like crying in the bathroom because I was really depressed when I was working there. Like, I wanted to end things, and I had started going to therapy, and I remember, I didn't even believe that God loved me. And so by default, like, how could I even love myself? And B, like, I couldn't imagine a life outside of the church or outside of even the next moment. I couldn't imagine like what would my future even look like. And I remember I was in a bathroom stall and I got a message from my future self. And it was so like viscerally real. And the message was just, you're going to make it and you're going to be happy. And I had never, ever felt that from myself before. Those messages always had to come from Jesus or from a conference talk or from like a church message, but it was me. And I just thought, holy shit, like, am I going to make it? Like, am I going to be okay? Like, that was me. Like, someone out there, a future version of myself is happy and fulfilled. Like, that blew my mind. And I remember talking to my therapist about it later, and I was like, I had this experience. Like, I really think I can envision a future for myself when I couldn't before. And it was
like a thought or feeling that came into your head, or as if you were communicating, a future you was communicating to the present you?
Yeah, just like in this bathroom stall, I was just thinking, and like I just had like a voice like in it, and I felt like so much love. And I was like, holy crap, like that's me talking to myself. And I had been doing like some reparenting work of like visiting my past selves, like my missionary self, and just telling her like, you're enough. You don't have to keep giving. You don't have to keep giving to the church. You don't have to feel like a failure. You gave enough. And I think once you start reparenting those past selves, it kind of makes you more able to envision a future self that's really proud of you, even if you feel broken in the moment or feel lost in the moment. Because I'm like, well, here I am talking to my old self. I think it's possible to envision my future self talking to the me right now. And it was a really powerful experience for me, and in like a moment of like self-love. And that's honestly another thing that led me out, was just realizing the only person I ever needed was me. And like something I've said a few times is like the only still small voice I ever needed was my own. So like the little voice that was with me that whole time saying, I don't think that these miracles are real, or I think you really like art. Why did you give that up for 7 years? You know, why did you focus so much on church when this is what has always fulfilled you? It was that little voice that eventually grew into a really big voice and helped me leave.
Wow. If, to a Mormon mind, quote, wickedness never was happiness. And then they'll say drinking or casual sex or not being married or whatever it is you might bring you joy, that might feel good to you now, that a Mormon would see as sin. They would either say, well, you can't be happy now because you're breaking the commandments. Or they would just say, people leave the church, maybe they think they're happy, but they're just deluded, What would you say to someone that was doubting your happiness now?
If someone was doubting my happiness now, I would just tell them, well, I believe that you're happy when you say you are. So like, and even though it's something that doesn't bring me happiness, right? So like if it's a member of the church, for example, if they tell me they're happy in it, I have no choice but to take them for their word on that. You have to meet people where they are, because if you don't meet them where they are, when they leave and you try to act all excited for them, they're going to be like, yeah, but where were you when I was excited about this other stuff? Because a version of them is truly excited. I was truly excited to go on a mission. And I think like you have to hold compassion for people. And so I guess if someone was saying like, I don't believe you're really happy, I guess I would just say, well, I guess it's just like my word against yours. Like, I don't know. I think it's important to show up for people where they are and to trust them when they say that something's bringing them joy. So like even with Mormons, I've been there. Like I really did believe that was bringing me happiness and joy. And if someone's expressing that to me, I think I have an obligation as a human being to say, wow, I'm really excited for you that you're happy about that. Like when my brothers went on missions, I remember being really conflicted about that because it was my fault that they were going because they were following their older sister's example. But I wasn't going to try to dissuade them because like nobody wants to be dissuaded from doing something that they really want. And if they had expressed doubts to me, I would have totally been like, hey, like, let's talk about it. But when someone's genuinely sharing something that comes from their heart, and I think that's what a lot of Mormons do, I think it's my obligation to say, wow, I'm really happy for you. Like, I believe you when you say that. And like, if you ever change your mind, I also believe you. Like, all of it can be true. And I just think that's important, because if you don't show up for people right now, when they leave later and they're finding a different kind of happiness, I think it's a little bit tainted if they go, yeah, but you like tried to convince me not to go on a mission. Like, that sucked, you know, things like that.
And if they say, but I my brain just can't wrap itself around how you could be living in sin and be happier than when you were in the church. Like, if they were to say, how can you be living in what I think is sin and somehow be happier? How is that even possible? So like, they want to believe you,
Yeah.
but in their minds, you can't be sinning and be happy.
I would, just in my experience, sin for me, it became very apparent that sin was just smoke and mirrors. So sin is the label that you put on things to scare people. And I understand like the brainwashing and the control and manipulation that goes into convincing people that these things are bad, but like, I have experienced it for myself. And like, I've said that before about people who like Mormons who say like, oh, these people just left the church and like to sin, or they're bad people. I look at them the same way that I look at like 11-year-olds who are learning about sex for the first time. And I'll get to my point in a second. But like, so when I was like 11, my mom told me about sex, and I remember being like, ew, like, what? I don't want to do that ever. But I was 11. Like, of course I didn't want to. I didn't even know like why you would ever want to do that. And that's how I see people who kind of go like, ew, you left the church. And I'm like, yeah, I'm telling you this as someone who has experienced it. Like, no, when a parent is telling their 11-year-old about sex and the 11-year-old is like, ew, like, the parent doesn't go, oh man, I guess I shouldn't do that anymore. Maybe they're right. Like, they just look at him like, yeah, you don't get it, but someday you will. And that's kind of how I view some of these Mormons that are like so adamant, like, oh, I would never leave the church, or that's disgusting, or I would never do that. That's so horrible. Is I'm like, yeah, that's nice. I'm going to pat your hand and just be like, I believe you that you don't want to do that. But that's not going to change my mind about it, because I've lived it. Like, that's, you know, like a parent looking at their 11-year-old is like, well, that's how you were created. Like, so I don't know what to tell you. Anyways, that's kind of how I view it, is just, I've lived it and experienced it, and you haven't. And maybe someday you will experience it and you will want to leave. And I hope that you can give space to that.
It sounds like fake sin is smoke and mirrors to make someone scared and or to manipulate someone towards something you want them to do. It sounds like real sin is self-betrayal.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't
that the real sin? All the ways that you were beating down your real voice inside?
Mm-hmm. And I think that leads to so many unhealthy things, if I'm being honest. Like, and I don't think it always results in horrible, harmful things, but I mean, we look at Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt and like all the stuff that's happened with them. I just look at that and I'm like, okay, someone wasn't confronting something inside of them that really needed to come out. Like, and it came out instead in these horrible ways. And I really think if there's like more compassion for those parts of you that you're not giving a voice to, once you start showing them more compassion, they're not going to come out in these sinister and evil ways. Like, it's almost impossible. Like, when you shine a light on the darkness, it has no choice but to just let itself be loved. And I think when you betray yourself, it leads to some really dark and bad things, which is honestly, like, that's what I saw all the time in confidential records, right? People had been told their whole lives, like, pornography is bad, you having sex is bad, blah, blah, blah.
Being gay is bad.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like just the secrecy and the shame and the way it compounds and led to even worse things when it's like, man, if only he had been told at 11, hey, porn is fine. How could that have changed the trajectory of somebody's life if they had been told?
Or not. There's a lot of people like, stop saying porn's good. How about just porn is a normal thing? Everybody sees it.
Yes.
Like, you don't even have to say porn is great. You could just say porn is something we all have to see it. We all see it at some point. Mm-hmm. So you're not bad for having seen it, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Just that message of you're not bad. If a lot of these people at young ages had been told what you are doing is normal, porn is normal, like it's neutral, right? I really feel like you would see a lot less chaos in people's lives as adults because it just starts a cycle of secrecy and shame.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, well, let's end by you plugging all the things you want to plug. I know you have a mini book of your time at the church. People can buy that. Maybe you want people to follow you. Maybe there's other things people can donate to support you.
Yeah.
What do you want to tell people?
So I do have, it's a PDF. I don't want the church to get a hold of it. So it's a PDF memoir. It's like 77 pages, just kind of talking about my time at the church. I covered some of it today, but there's more details in there. And I think it's just an interesting view into what it was like working there. So you can get that through my Indiegogo page for my short film. So it's a perk for my short film, is just $10. You can get the memoir, and I'll send it to you via email. But I'm also on like every social media platform as Poetic Kate, one word. So feel free to follow me. I don't talk a ton about the church on there, but I do occasionally, and you can just watch and see other projects I'm working on. So.
Poetic Kate. And the Indiegogo, is it Poetic Kate as well?
It's actually just like every social media website that I have right now has that link in the bio. So if you just check the bio.
Okay. And you're not fundraising for a movie right now or anything like that?
I am. Okay. So it's a short film. It's called Ho Phase, I mentioned, and it's basically just my way of trying to normalize some of the stuff we've been talking about. So like my whole life I was told abortion is wrong and it's bad. And then I went through an abortion myself and I was like, okay, this isn't as serious as everybody has always told me. So I kind of wanted to write a short film around that. It's actually a feature-length film, but we're doing a short film version of it just to shop around at festivals and things. But if you donate to the Indiegogo campaign, you'll be invited to like a live read-through of the feature-length script. You'll get a copy of the short film when it's done. There's a bunch of perks involved. So
that's still, it's
still live. Okay, yeah, we're still accepting donations. I anticipate it being like a months long endeavor. Even though we're filming at the end of the month, there's like festival fees involved and post-production fees and stuff like that. So
I think I first saw you on Latter Daily Digest. Is that right?
Yeah. I was talking to Maven and Jean.
Mm-hmm. So shout out to Maven and Jean first, and then to Bill Reel and RFM second. And I need to pay more close attention to my DMs.
Yeah, in November, I was like, I think I'm ready to talk to John. And then it slipped through the cracks. Totally fine, though. I know you're so busy.
All right. Well, Caitlin Whitaker, thank you for your amazing, powerful, empowering story and your courage. I know that a lot of people are going to see this, and it's going to help a lot of people. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to help get rid of some of that shame for people, kind of pull the curtain back.
Yeah. Please like this episode right now. Hit the like button. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel and wherever you can subscribe. Please comment in the comments. All those things really help with the algorithms to promote it. It also helps if you share this episode widely. So please do all of those things. Also, please know that we can only do this because of the generous donations of our donors. So thank you if you're a monthly donor or an annual donor. We couldn't do it without you. If you're not a donor and you want to see content like this continue, it's really simple. You go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, sign up to be a monthly donor, And we will continue providing content like this. We're toying with the idea of releasing highly edited interviews on YouTube because they'll do better on YouTube and because there's always people that are wanting a highly edited version, and then releasing the full unedited version to donors who donate. So we're playing with that model. That may or may not be implemented by the time this comes out, but know that that's in the works. If you have feedback about that or other thoughts, you can email us at mormonstories@gmail.com, or you can comment in this episode, and we would love to see that as well. But that's how you can help us. And if you can't donate, again, just liking every episode, commenting on every episode, and subscribing and sharing, that makes a huge, huge difference. So anyway, Kaylin Whitaker, hope to see you again. Hope you'll come back.
John.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
Good luck with everything. Good luck with hoe phase.
Thank you.
Yeah.
From church employment to hoe phase.
Beautiful. All right. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other. And we'll see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. And if you are a former Mormon Church employee and you want to tell your story, we love to hear inside stories because people love to hear them. So please reach out and email me, and I'll try to actually respond when you say I'm a former Mormon Church employee or current Mormon Church employee or Mormon bishop or Mormon stake president or Mormon Relief Society or temple president or mission president or whatever, missionary. We love insider stories. So please reach out if you've got one to share. Take care, everyone. See you soon.